The dusty mounds of Kuyunjik, rising from the banks of the Tigris River across from modern Mosul, held secrets that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient literature. In the winter of 1849, Austin Henry Layard's pickaxe struck something harder than the usual clay and debris, the corner of what would prove to be the palace of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. What Layard and his team uncovered in the following months would fundamentally alter humanity's perception of its literary heritage, though they could not have known it at the time. Working alongside local labourers in conditions that would challenge even the most determined archaeologist, Layard methodically excavated room after room of the ancient palace. The winter months provided relief from the scorching heat that would make summer excavation nearly impossible, but brought their own challenges of mud and occasional flooding from the nearby river. As his team carefully removed centuries of accumulated debris, they began to uncover thousands of clay tablets, many broken into fragments, covered in the wedge-shaped marks that scholars were just beginning to understand as cuneiform script. The scale of the discovery became apparent as excavation continued through 1850 and beyond. Hormuzd Rassam, Layard's capable assistant who would later lead excavations in his own right, recognised the significance of what they were finding. The tablets were not random artefacts, but appeared to be part of a systematic collection, what scholars would later identify as the Great Library of Ashurbanipal, assembled in the 7th century BC. This library represented one of the world's first attempts at creating a comprehensive repository of human knowledge, containing everything from administrative records to literary masterpieces, mathematical treatises to religious texts. The physical process of extracting these tablets required extraordinary care. Many had been damaged by fire when the palace was destroyed, ironically helping to preserve them by hardening the clay. Others had been crushed by falling masonry or cracked by the weight of centuries of accumulated debris. Each tablet had to be carefully cleaned, catalogued, and prepared for shipment to the British Museum in London, where the real work of decipherment would begin. By the time Layard concluded his excavations at Nineveh in 1851, he'd recovered approximately 30,000 tablets and fragments. The magnitude of this literary treasure trove was staggering, representing the accumulated wisdom of millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. Among these thousands of tablets, one particular set would capture the imagination of the world, though it would take more than 2 decades for its significance to be fully recognised. George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, spent years painstakingly piecing together fragments and deciphering the complex cuneiform script. His background was unconventional for a scholar. He had worked as a banknote engraver before becoming fascinated with ancient scripts. This practical experience with detailed visual work proved invaluable as he examined the minute details of cuneiform signs, many of which had been damaged or partially obscured. On a December day in 1872, Smith was working through a collection of tablets when he encountered a passage that made him pause. The text described a great flood, a righteous man who built a boat to save his family and animals, and the sending of birds to test whether the waters had receded. The parallels to the biblical account of Noah's flood were unmistakable, but this version was clearly much older than any known Hebrew text. Smith's excitement was such that, according to contemporary accounts, he began to undress in his enthusiasm, a reaction that, while perhaps exaggerated in the telling, reflected the genuine significance of his discovery. The tablets Smith was reading formed part of what would become known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the 11th tablet containing Utnapishtim's account of the Great Flood. This discovery would prove to be one of the most significant moments in the history of biblical and literary scholarship, demonstrating that many stories considered uniquely Hebrew had much earlier Mesopotamian origins. The world into which this epic was born was one of unprecedented urban development and cultural sophistication. During the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2334 BC, Mesopotamia witnessed the rise of the world's first true cities. Uruk, the city most closely associated with Gilgamesh, was a marvel of ancient engineering and urban planning. Archaeological evidence suggests that at its height, Uruk may have housed as many as 50,000 people within its walls, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The physical appearance of these early Mesopotamian cities would have been striking to modernize. Massive mud brick walls, often 30 feet high and equally thick, surrounded the urban core. Within these walls, narrow streets wound between closely packed houses, workshops and temples. The most prominent feature of any Mesopotamian city was its ziggurat, a stepped pyramid temple that could be seen for miles across the flat alluvial plain. These structures, built entirely of mud, brick and bitumen, required constant maintenance in the harsh climate, but they served as both religious centres and symbols of civic pride. The society that produced the earliest versions of the Gilgamesh stories was highly stratified. At the top stood the Lugal or king, who served as both military leader and high priest. Below him were the nobles and priests, followed by merchants, artisans and farmers. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, often prisoners of war, or people who had fallen into debt. This social structure is reflected in the epic itself, where Gilgamesh's divine parentage and royal status are emphasized throughout the narrative. The economic foundation of these early Mesopotamian cities was agriculture, specifically the cultivation of barley and wheat in the fertile alluvial soil deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. However, this agricultural abundance required sophisticated irrigation systems. Networks of canals, dikes and reservoirs had to be constantly maintained to prevent both drought and flooding. The epic reflects this preoccupation with water management in its frequent references to the life-giving properties of rivers and the destructive power of floods. The religious worldview of early dynastic Mesopotamia was polytheistic and deeply concerned with the relationship between humans and gods. The pantheon was headed by Anu, the sky god, followed by Enlil, god of wind and storms, and Ea, later called Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Each city had its own patron deity, and the epic reflects this religious landscape in its portrayal of various gods and their interactions with mortals. During the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC, Mesopotamian literature underwent significant development. This was the era when many of the individual Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh were first compiled into longer narrative sequences. The political landscape had changed dramatically since the early dynastic period. The Akkadian Empire had risen and fallen, and now various Amorite dynasties controlled different parts of Mesopotamia. The most famous of these was the dynasty of Hammurabi in Babylon, which created the first known comprehensive legal code. The Old Babylonian period saw increased literacy and the establishment of scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia. These schools, attached to temples and palaces, were responsible for training the administrative personnel needed to run increasingly complex urban societies. Students learned to read and write by copying classical texts, including the stories of Gilgamesh. This educational system ensured that these narratives were preserved and transmitted across generations, even as the political landscape continued to change. The literary culture of this period was sophisticated and self-conscious. Scribes were not merely copyists, but active interpreters and editors of the texts they transmitted. They combined earlier Sumerian stories, added new episodes, and created narrative connections that transformed individual tales into coherent epic narratives. The process was gradual and involved multiple generations of scribes, each contributing to the evolving tradition. The transformation from the earlier Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh to the standard Babylonian version represents one of the most significant developments in world literature. The Sumerian stories, dating to around 2100 BC, were individual tales that focused on specific adventures. Gilgamesh's conflict with Aga of Kish, his journey to the cedar forest, his relationship with Enkidu, and his quest for immortality. These stories were already ancient when they were first written down, having been transmitted orally for generations. The figure of Sinleki-Unnini, traditionally credited with compiling the standard Babylonian version in the 7th century BC, remains somewhat mysterious. What we know of him comes primarily from later references and colophons, scribal signatures, found on tablets. He appears to have been a scholar priest attached to the temple of Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, in Babylon. His work involved not merely copying earlier versions, but creating a unified narrative structure that would become the definitive version of the epic. Sinleki-Unnini's achievement was remarkable in its scope and sophistication. He took the disparate Sumerian stories and wove them into a coherent narrative arc that explored fundamental questions about human nature, mortality, and the relationship between civilization and the natural world. He added new episodes, developed character relationships, and created thematic connections that transformed the material into something approaching a modern novel in its psychological complexity. The standard Babylonian version consisted of 11 tablets, each containing roughly 300 lines of verse. The narrative structure was carefully planned, with the first tablet introducing Gilgamesh and his city, the middle tablets following his adventures with Enkidu and their various quests, and the final tablets focusing on Gilgamesh's confrontation with mortality following Enkidu's death. This structure creates a satisfying dramatic arc that moves from youthful adventure to mature wisdom. The literary techniques employed in the standard Babylonian version were sophisticated and influential. The epic makes extensive use of parallel structure, where similar phrases or ideas are repeated with slight variations. This technique, common in oral poetry, helps create rhythm and emphasis while making the text easier to memorize. The epic also employs complex metaphorical language and symbolic imagery that would influence later literary traditions throughout the ancient Near East. The influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh on subsequent ancient Near Eastern literature cannot be overstated. Elements of the epic appear in various forms throughout the region's literary tradition. The flood narrative, as Smith discovered, clearly influenced the biblical account of Noah. The theme of a hero's quest for immortality appears in various forms in later Greek and Roman literature. The concept of civilization versus nature, central to the Gilgamesh epic, became a recurring theme in ancient literature. The epic's treatment of friendship, particularly the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, established literary conventions that would persist for millennia. The idea of complementary opposites, the civilized king and the wild man, became a standard motif in later literature. Similarly, the epic's exploration of the tension between human ambition and divine will influenced religious and philosophical thought throughout the ancient world. The preservation of the epic through multiple periods of political upheaval demonstrates the high regard in which it was held by ancient scholars. Copies have been found not only in Mesopotamia, but also in the Hittite capital of Hattusa in Syria and in other parts of the ancient Near East. This wide distribution indicates that the epic was considered essential reading for educated people throughout the region. The rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the 19th century came at a crucial moment in the development of modern historical and literary scholarship. The decipherment of cuneiform script was opening up entirely new vistas of human history, revealing civilizations that had been completely forgotten. The epic provided dramatic evidence that sophisticated literature existed thousands of years before the classical Greek and Roman authors who had previously been considered the founders of Western literature. The transformation of the Epic of Gilgamesh from rediscovered ancient text to recognized literary masterpiece raised fundamental questions about the historical reality behind the legendary figure. While scholars marveled at the epic's literary sophistication and cultural significance, they also began investigating whether Gilgamesh himself had been a real person. The answer lay buried in the archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia and in the careful analysis of early historical documents that predated the epic by centuries. The Sumerian king list, a crucial document compiled around 2100 BC but drawing on much earlier sources, provides our most direct evidence for Gilgamesh's historical existence. This text, found on multiple tablets from various Mesopotamian sites, represents an attempt by ancient scribes to create a comprehensive record of legitimate rulership, stretching back to the mythical time when kingship first descended from heaven. The king list follows a consistent format, listing rulers by dynasty, noting the length of their reigns, and occasionally including brief comments about their accomplishments or the circumstances of their rule. According to the Sumerian king list, Gilgamesh was the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, ruling for 126 years around 2700 BC. The document identifies him as the son of Lugalbanda, who had ruled before him, and notes that his mother was the goddess Ninsun. This divine parentage, while clearly mythological, reflects the ancient Mesopotamian practice of claiming divine ancestry for particularly significant rulers. The king list places Gilgamesh's reign during a period of political consolidation in southern Mesopotamia, when individual city-states were establishing their territorial boundaries and developing the administrative systems that would characterize later Mesopotamian civilization. The historical accuracy of the Sumerian king list has been debated by scholars, particularly regarding the impossibly long reigns attributed to early rulers. However, archaeological evidence increasingly supports the existence of many of the kings mentioned in the document, even if their actual reign lengths were considerably shorter than claimed. The list's value lies not in its precise chronology, but in its preservation of genuine historical memory about early Mesopotamian rulers and their relative sequence. Archaeological investigations at Uruk, the ancient city where Gilgamesh allegedly ruled, have revealed a settlement of extraordinary size and sophistication for its time. Located in modern-day Iraq near the town of Warka, approximately 300 kilometers southeast of Baghdad, Uruk sits on the banks of the ancient Euphrates River. The site has been continuously excavated since the late 19th century, revealing layer upon layer of occupation spanning more than 4 millennia. The most impressive archaeological feature at Uruk that potentially connects to the historical Gilgamesh is the massive defensive wall system that once surrounded the city. These fortifications, constructed of mud brick and bitumen, stretch for approximately 9 kilometers around the urban core. The walls stood roughly 30 feet high and were reinforced with towers at regular intervals. The construction required an enormous investment of labour and resources, suggesting a powerful ruler capable of mobilising the entire population for a massive public works project. Archaeological dating of the wall system places its construction during the early dynastic period, consistent with the time frame suggested by the Sumerian king list for Gilgamesh's reign. The engineering sophistication required for such a project indicates a highly organised state apparatus with access to skilled architects, engineers and thousands of labourers. The walls were not merely defensive structures, but also served as symbols of civic pride and royal power, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian landscape. The scale of Uruk during this period was unprecedented in human history. Archaeological surveys suggest the city covered approximately 600 hectares within its walls, housing an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 people. This population density required sophisticated urban planning, including systems for water distribution, waste management, and food storage. The city's layout included distinct districts with different activities: residential areas, craft workshops, administrative buildings, and religious complexes centered around massive temple precincts. The material culture uncovered at Uruk during the early dynastic period reflects a society of considerable wealth and artistic achievement. Excavations have revealed elaborate cylinder seals bearing intricate designs, sophisticated metalwork in bronze and precious metals, and ceramic vessels of exceptional quality. The presence of imported materials such as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cedar wood from Lebanon indicates extensive trade networks that would have required diplomatic and commercial relationships with the distant regions. The transformation of the historical Gilgamesh into a legendary figure began during his own lifetime and accelerated in the centuries following his death. This process reflects the natural tendency of oral tradition to embellish and mythologize the deeds of exceptional individuals. The historical king's actual accomplishments, impressive as they may have been, provided the foundation for increasingly elaborate stories that emphasized his superhuman qualities and divine connections. The earliest written references to Gilgamesh appear in Sumerian texts dating to around 2100 BC, roughly 600 years after his probable historical reign. These early literary works, including Gilgamesh and Aga of Kish, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, and the Death of Gilgamesh, present him as a powerful king engaged in both military conflicts and supernatural adventures. The gap between the historical period and these earliest literary treatments allowed for considerable mythological elaboration while preserving certain core elements that may reflect genuine historical memory. The process of legendary transformation followed patterns common to heroic traditions worldwide. The historical Gilgamesh's military victories over neighbouring cities became epic battles against monsters and supernatural forces. His construction projects, particularly the Great Wall of Uruk, were attributed to divine inspiration and superhuman strength. His political alliances and diplomatic marriages were transformed into relationships with gods and goddesses. Most significantly, his inevitable death as a mortal king became the central theme of a quest for immortality that forms the emotional core of the later epic. Archaeological evidence suggests that the historical Gilgamesh was indeed a successful military leader who expanded Uruk's territorial control and established its dominance over neighbouring city-states. Excavations at sites throughout southern Mesopotamia have revealed evidence of widespread conflict during the early dynastic period, with many settlements showing signs of destruction and rebuilding. The consolidation of political power in fewer larger centres like Uruk reflects the success of rulers like Gilgamesh in subjugating smaller rivals. The historical king's building projects extended beyond the famous walls to include temples, palaces, and infrastructure improvements throughout his territory. Excavations at Uruk have revealed massive temple complexes dating to the early dynastic period, including the Anu Ziggurat and the Eanna precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna. These structures required sophisticated engineering knowledge and enormous labour forces, suggesting a ruler with exceptional organisational abilities and access to substantial resources. The economic foundation of Gilgamesh's historical kingdom was agriculture, supplemented by craft production and long-distance trade. The fertile alluvial soil of southern Mesopotamia, watered by an extensive irrigation system, produced surplus grain that supported the large urban population and funded the king's ambitious building projects. Archaeological evidence indicates that Uruk controlled not only its immediate agricultural hinterland, but also important trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Iran, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf. The religious dimensions of Gilgamesh's historical reign were equally significant. As king of Uruk, he would have served as high priest of the city's patron deities, particularly Anu and Inanna. This religious role was not merely ceremonial but involved real political power, as the temples controlled significant agricultural land and commercial enterprises. The king's relationship with the priesthood was crucial for maintaining social stability and legitimizing his rule. The historical Gilgamesh's death, probably around 2650 BC, marked the end of a remarkable reign that had transformed Uruk from a regional centre into the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia. The immediate aftermath of his death saw the continuation of his dynasty under his successors, but none achieved comparable fame or left such lasting impressions on the historical record. The gap between his historical achievements and his legendary status continued to widen as successive generations of storytellers elaborated on his deeds. The comparison between the historical king and his mythologized counterpart reveals both continuities and dramatic transformations. The epic's portrayal of Gilgamesh as a powerful but sometimes tyrannical ruler may reflect genuine historical memory of an autocratic king who demanded heavy labor service from his subjects. The emphasis on his building projects, particularly the walls of Uruk, directly corresponds to archaeological evidence of massive construction during the early dynastic period. However, the epic's supernatural elements represent clear departures from historical reality. The historical Gilgamesh was almost certainly entirely human, despite later claims of divine parentage. His adventures with Enkidu, his battles with monsters, and his quest for immortality belong to the realm of mythology rather than history. These elements were added by later storytellers to transform a successful but mortal king into a figure of universal significance, who embodied humanity's eternal struggles with mortality, friendship, and the tension between civilization and nature. The historical king's relationships with neighbouring rulers were probably characterized by the typical mixture of warfare, diplomacy, and marriage alliances that marked early dynastic politics. The epic's transformation of these political relationships into cosmic conflicts between good and evil reflects the tendency of heroic literature to elevate local conflicts to universal significance. Similarly, the historical Gilgamesh's inevitable death from natural causes became, in the epic tradition, a profound meditation on human mortality and the search for meaning in a finite existence. The preservation of genuine historical elements within the legendary tradition demonstrates the remarkable continuity of Mesopotamian cultural memory. Despite centuries of political upheaval and cultural change, the essential facts of Gilgamesh's reign, his rule over Uruk, his building projects, his military successes, remained embedded in the epic tradition. This historical foundation provided the narrative framework that allowed later poets to explore timeless themes while maintaining connection to a specific time and place. The archaeological evidence of Gilgamesh's impressive building projects and military conquests tells only part of the story that would eventually become the Epic of Gilgamesh. The historical record, while demonstrating his effectiveness as a ruler, remains silent about the human cost of his achievements. It was the epic tradition itself that preserved the darker aspects of his reign, transforming the memory of a successful but autocratic Bronze Age king into a profound meditation on the abuse of power and the divine response to tyranny. The standard Babylonian version of the epic opens not with celebration of Gilgamesh's accomplishments, but with a stark portrayal of despotic rule that had pushed the people of Uruk to the breaking point. The text describes a king who had transformed from protector to oppressor, using his divine heritage and royal prerogatives to justify increasingly brutal treatment of his subjects. This portrayal reflects a sophisticated understanding of how absolute power could corrupt even the most capable rulers, a theme that would resonate throughout ancient Near Eastern political thought. Gilgamesh's oppression manifested in multiple forms that systematically degraded the social fabric of Uruk. The epic describes how he appropriated the traditional rite of jus prima noctis, claiming sexual access to brides before their weddings could be consummated. This practice, while historically documented in various ancient societies, represented a fundamental violation of family structures and social bonds that held communities together. The king's assertion of this right demonstrated his complete disregard for the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives, transforming what should have been joyous occasions into sources of humiliation and rage. The sexual exploitation extended beyond new brides to encompass a broader pattern of predatory behaviour toward the women of Uruk. The epic suggests that no woman, regardless of her social status or family connections, was safe from the king's desires. This systematic abuse created an atmosphere of fear and resentment that permeated every level of society. Fathers could not protect their daughters, husbands could not defend their wives, and the traditional structures of family honour and protection crumbled under the weight of royal tyranny. The king's abuse of power extended into the economic sphere through his demands for excessive labour service. The massive construction projects that had made Uruk famous required enormous human resources, but Gilgamesh's approach to mobilising these resources showed complete disregard for his subjects' welfare. The epic describes how he conscripted young men for building projects without regard for agricultural seasons or family obligations, disrupting the economic cycles that sustained urban life. Fields went unharvested while their owners laboured on royal monuments, creating food shortages that affected the entire population. The military dimensions of Gilgamesh's tyranny were equally oppressive. While his conquests had expanded Uruk's territory and brought wealth to the city, they also demanded continuous military service from the male population. The king's appetite for warfare seemed insatiable, driving him to launch campaigns that served his personal glory rather than the city's genuine security needs. Young men were conscripted for these adventures with no consideration for their families' needs or their own survival, creating a demographic crisis as casualties mounted and productive members of society were lost to unnecessary conflicts. The epic's portrayal of these abuses reflects a sophisticated understanding of how tyranny operates in practice. Gilgamesh's oppression was not random violence but systematic exploitation that touched every aspect of his subjects' lives. He used his position to extract maximum benefit for himself, while externalizing all costs onto the population. The divine parentage that should have made him a benevolent protector instead became justification for treating mortals as expendable resources for his personal satisfaction. The psychological impact of this oppression on Uruk's population was devastating. The epic describes a city where fear had replaced civic pride, where families lived in constant anxiety about their safety and future. The traditional bonds of loyalty between ruler and subjects had been severed, replaced by resentment and desperation. The people who had once celebrated their king's achievements now viewed him as an enemy whose very existence threatened their basic human dignity. The social consequences of Gilgamesh's tyranny extended beyond individual suffering to undermine the foundations of civilized society. The rule of law, essential for urban life, had been replaced by royal caprice. Justice became impossible when the king himself was the primary source of injustice. The economic systems that supported the city's prosperity began to break down as the population's energy was diverted from productive activities to serving the king's personal desires. The religious institutions that should have provided moral guidance found themselves compromised by their dependence on royal patronage. The people's response to this oppression followed patterns familiar from other instances of tyranny throughout history. Initially, they endured in silence, hoping that the king's behaviour would moderate or that natural forces would intervene. However, as the abuse continued and intensified, their desperation drove them to seek supernatural assistance. The epic's portrayal of their prayers to the gods represents more than simple religious devotion. It reflects the complete breakdown of earthly remedies for their suffering. The prayers directed to Anu, the supreme god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, carried particular significance. As the divine king of the gods, Anu was considered the ultimate source of legitimate authority on earth. The people's appeal to him represented a formal challenge to Gilgamesh's legitimacy, arguing that his behaviour had violated the divine mandate that justified royal rule. This theological dimension of their complaint transformed their suffering from mere political grievance into a cosmic crisis requiring divine intervention. The parallel prayers to Aruru, the goddess of creation, reflected a different but equally profound understanding of the crisis. Aruru had been responsible for creating humanity itself, and the people's appeal to her emphasized how Gilgamesh's tyranny threatened the very essence of human dignity and social order. Their prayers requested not merely relief from oppression, but active intervention to restore the balance between ruler and ruled that made civilized life possible. The epic's description of these prayers reveals the sophisticated theological thinking that had developed in Mesopotamian religion by the time of the standard Babylonian version. The people understood that divine intervention would not come automatically, but required proper ritual approach and compelling justification. Their prayers emphasized not personal grievances, but the broader threat that Gilgamesh's behavior posed to the divine order itself. They argued that allowing such tyranny to continue would undermine the gods' own authority and the cosmic principles they represented. The divine response to these prayers demonstrates the epic's complex understanding of how supernatural forces interact with human affairs. The gods did not simply punish Gilgamesh for his crimes, but instead chose to address the underlying problem through creative intervention. Their decision to create Enkidu represented a sophisticated solution that would transform the tyrant king rather than simply destroying him, reflecting the epic's ultimate concern with redemption and growth rather than mere retribution. Uru's role in creating Enkidu carried deep symbolic significance that connected to broader themes in Mesopotamian mythology. As the goddess who had originally shaped humanity from clay, her decision to create a new being specifically to counter Gilgamesh's excesses represented a kind of divine correction to her earlier work. The epic suggests that the gods recognized their own responsibility for the crisis, since Gilgamesh's divine parentage had contributed to his sense of superiority over ordinary mortals. The process of Enkidu's creation, as described in the epic, involved careful consideration of what qualities would be needed to match and redirect Gilgamesh's excessive energies. Uru designed him to be equal in strength and courage to the king, but fundamentally different in character and values. Where Gilgamesh represented the pinnacle of civilized achievement corrupted by power, Enkidu would embody natural virtue uncorrupted by social hierarchy or political ambition. The epic's portrayal of divine intervention reflects sophisticated thinking about the relationship between supernatural forces and human political systems. The gods' response to the people's prayers was not arbitrary, but followed logical principles that respected both divine authority and human dignity. They chose to work through natural means rather than miraculous intervention, creating a being who would operate within the normal parameters of human existence while possessing the extraordinary qualities needed to challenge Gilgamesh effectively. The theological implications of this divine response extended beyond the immediate crisis in Uruk to address fundamental questions about the nature of legitimate authority. The epic suggests that rulers derive their power from divine sanction, but remain accountable to both gods and subjects for how they exercise that power. When a king violates this sacred trust, the gods themselves will intervene to restore proper order, not necessarily through punishment but through transformation and education. The creation of Enkidu also represented a sophisticated solution to the problem of absolute power itself. Rather than simply removing Gilgamesh from the throne, which would have created political chaos, the gods chose to provide him with an equal who could serve as both companion and constraint. This approach recognized that Gilgamesh's exceptional abilities were not inherently evil, but had been misdirected by isolation and unchecked power. The introduction of a true peer into his life would force him to confront the consequences of his actions and develop the empathy necessary for just rule. The epic's treatment of these themes reveals the political sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian thought about governance and authority. The text demonstrates clear understanding that tyranny emerges not from inherent evil, but from the corruption of power by isolation and lack of accountability. The divine solution addresses these root causes rather than merely treating symptoms, suggesting that the epic's authors had observed the cyclical nature of political oppression and sought to identify sustainable remedies. The people's prayers and the divine response also illuminate the epic's understanding of collective action and social responsibility. The citizens of Uruk did not simply endure their oppression passively, but took active steps to address it through proper channels. Their appeal to the gods represented a form of political action that respected existing authority structures while seeking redress for legitimate grievances. This approach reflected the sophisticated political culture that had developed in Mesopotamian city-states, where citizens understood both their obligations to legitimate authority and their rights to protection from abuse. The divine solution to Gilgamesh's tyranny required a being of extraordinary nature, one who could match the king's superhuman strength while embodying the natural virtues that civilization had corrupted in him. Aruru, the goddess of creation who had first shaped humanity from the primordial clay, accepted the challenge presented by the desperate prayers of Uruk's oppressed citizens. Her task was not merely to create another human being, but to fashion a counterpart who could serve as both mirror and antithesis to the tyrant king. Working with the same fundamental materials she had used to create the first humans, Aruru gathered clay from the wilderness steppes far beyond the walls of any city. This clay, untouched by human hands and uncontaminated by the corruptions of civilized life, would form the physical substance of her new creation. The goddess moistened the earth with water from wild springs, sources that had never been channeled through human irrigation systems or contained within artificial reservoirs. Every element of Enkidu's creation emphasized his connection to the natural world and his separation from the urban environment that had produced Gilgamesh's moral corruption. The process of shaping Enkidu required divine artistry of the highest order. Aruru moulded not just a human form, but a being who would embody the strength and nobility of the animal kingdom while retaining the essential spark of human consciousness. His body emerged from her hands with the muscular development of a man who had never known ease or comfort, every sinew hardened by constant physical exertion in the harsh wilderness environment. His frame was massive and powerful, built on a scale that matched Gilgamesh's own divine heritage, but achieved through natural development rather than supernatural endowment. The goddess endowed Enkidu with physical capabilities that would allow him to survive and thrive in the most challenging natural environments. His senses were heightened beyond normal human capacity, allowing him to track animals across vast distances, detect the approach of predators, and navigate by subtle environmental cues invisible to civilized humans. His reflexes operated with the lightning speed necessary for survival among wild beasts, while his endurance surpassed even that of the nomadic peoples who lived on the margins of settled society. Enkidu's appearance reflected his wild origins in every detail. His hair grew long and thick, forming a mane-like covering that protected him from the harsh sun and cold nights of the open steppes. Unlike the carefully groomed beards of civilized men, his facial hair grew wild and untamed, giving him a fierce aspect that commanded respect from both animals and any humans who might encounter him. His skin was darkened and toughened by constant exposure to the elements, bearing the scars and calluses that marked a life of continuous physical challenge. The clothing that Aruru provided for her creation consisted entirely of animal skins, but these were not the carefully prepared and decorated garments worn by hunters and herders. Instead, Enkidu wore the raw pelts of animals that had died natural deaths, roughly fashioned into coverings that provided protection without compromising his connection to the animal world. These primitive garments allowed him to move silently through the wilderness and to approach wild creatures without triggering their instinctive fear of human predators. Enkidu's initial existence in the wilderness represented a perfect harmony between human intelligence and natural instinct. Unlike the first humans, who had been created for life in gardens and cities, he was specifically designed for survival in the untamed world beyond civilization's borders. His knowledge came not from formal education or cultural transmission, but from direct observation and intuitive understanding of natural patterns and relationships. He could read the subtle signs that indicated changing weather, locate water sources in seemingly barren landscapes, and predict the movements of animal herds across seasonal migration routes. The relationship between Enkidu and the wild animals of the steppes transcended the normal boundaries between human and beast. Rather than viewing animals as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be overcome, he understood them as fellow inhabitants of a shared world deserving of respect and protection. His presence among animal herds caused no alarm or disruption, as they recognized in him a kindred spirit who posed no threat to their welfare. Gazelles would graze peacefully in his vicinity, wild cattle would allow him to approach their calves, and even predators like lions and wolves accepted his presence without hostility. This extraordinary relationship with the animal kingdom was based on mutual understanding and benefit rather than domination. Enkidu served as a protector and guardian for the creatures of the wilderness, using his human intelligence to shield them from the various dangers that threatened their survival. When drought struck the steppes, he would guide herds to hidden water sources that only he knew how to find. During harsh winters, he would lead animals to sheltered valleys where they could find protection from storms and adequate forage to survive until spring. The most significant aspect of Enkidu's protective role involved his interference with human hunting activities. The wilderness areas where he lived were regularly visited by hunters from various settlements who sought to capture animals for food, hides, and other valuable materials. These hunting expeditions, while necessary for human survival, often involved methods that Enkidu found cruel and wasteful. Hunters would set snares and traps that caused prolonged suffering to their victims, or they would kill more animals than they could use, leaving carcasses to rot while taking only the most valuable parts. Enkidu's response to these hunting activities demonstrated both his intelligence and his commitment to protecting his animal companions. He would systematically locate and destroy trap lines, freeing animals that had been caught and dismantling the devices before they could claim new victims. His knowledge of animal behavior allowed him to warn herds of approaching hunters, causing them to change their routes or seek shelter in areas where human pursuit would be impossible. When hunters attempted to drive animals into confined areas for mass slaughter, Enkidu would create diversions that allowed the intended victims to escape. The physical methods Enkidu employed to protect animals from hunters required both strength and stealth. He could move through the wilderness with complete silence, approaching trap lines without alerting their creators or any guards they might have posted. His powerful hands could break apart even the most sophisticated snares and pitfalls, while his knowledge of animal psychology allowed him to calm frightened creatures and guide them to safety. When direct confrontation with hunters became necessary, his imposing physical presence and obvious strength usually convinced them to abandon their efforts without violence. The impact of Enkidu's interference on local hunting communities was significant and growing. Hunters who had previously relied on certain territories for their livelihood found their success rates declining dramatically as their traps were repeatedly destroyed and their prey disappeared. The economic consequences affected not only the hunters themselves, but also the communities that depended on their activities for food and trade goods. Families that had traditionally supported themselves through hunting and trapping found their income sources threatened by this mysterious figure, who seemed to appear wherever they attempted to work. The hunters' initial response to these mysterious interventions was confusion and frustration. They could find no explanation for the systematic destruction of their equipment, or the sudden wariness of animals that had previously been easy prey. Some attributed the phenomena to hostile spirits or malevolent supernatural forces, while others suspected sabotage by rival hunting groups seeking to monopolize the best territories. The discovery of human footprints at the sites of destroyed traps only deepened the mystery, as no known person possessed the skills necessary to move so silently through the wilderness or to approach wild animals without causing alarm. As reports of the mysterious wilderness guardian spread among hunting communities, various theories emerged about his identity and motivations. Some hunters believed they were dealing with a hermit or exile who had somehow learned to survive in the wild and had developed an irrational attachment to the animals he lived among. Others suggested that he might be a member of some unknown nomadic tribe with customs that prohibited the killing of certain animals. The most superstitious hunters convinced themselves that they faced a supernatural being, perhaps a forest spirit or transformed animal that had taken human form to protect its kind. The growing conflict between Enkidu and the hunting communities created a crisis that demanded resolution. The hunters' inability to pursue their traditional livelihood threatened the economic stability of entire settlements, while Enkidu's protective activities grew more bold and extensive as he gained confidence in his abilities. The situation had reached a point where direct confrontation seemed inevitable, but the hunters' fear of this mysterious figure and their inability to locate him in the vast wilderness made any organised response extremely difficult. The physical environment where Enkidu lived and operated was harsh and unforgiving, testing even his extraordinary capabilities on a daily basis. The steppes stretched for hundreds of miles in all directions, broken only by occasional rocky outcroppings, seasonal streams, and scattered groves of hardy trees. During summer months, the temperature could reach levels that would kill ordinary humans, while winter brought bitter cold and driving winds that made survival a constant struggle. The landscape offered little natural shelter, forcing Enkidu to create his own refuges in caves, rock crevices, and dense thickets. Water sources in this environment were scarce and often unreliable, requiring intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns and hidden springs to ensure survival. Enkidu had memorized the locations of every permanent water source within hundreds of miles, as well as the seasonal streams and temporary pools that appeared only during certain weather conditions. His ability to find water in seemingly barren areas was crucial, not only for his own survival, but also for his role as protector of the animal herds that depended on his guidance during drought periods. The food resources available in the wilderness were limited and required constant foraging to maintain adequate nutrition. Enkidu's diet consisted primarily of wild plants, fruits, nuts, and roots, supplemented by occasional consumption of animals that had died from natural causes. His knowledge of edible plants was encyclopedic, encompassing not only obvious food sources but also the subtle seasonal variations that determined when different plants were safe to eat and when they might be toxic. This botanical expertise allowed him to maintain his health and strength, despite the absence of cultivated foods or domestic animals. The social isolation of Enkidu's existence was profound and complete. Apart from his interactions with animals and his confrontations with hunters, he lived entirely alone, without the companionship, conversation, or cultural stimulation that humans normally require for psychological health. His only communication was with the animals he protected, and while this relationship provided emotional satisfaction, it could not fulfill the deeper human need for intellectual and social connection. This isolation was perhaps the most significant aspect of his existence, creating a vulnerability that would eventually lead to his transformation. The growing disruption of hunting activities in the wilderness territories surrounding Uruk had created economic hardship that extended far beyond the immediate hunting communities. Trade networks that depended on regular supplies of animal hides, meat, and other wilderness products began to experience serious shortages. Merchants who had established contracts with hunting groups found themselves unable to fulfill their obligations, creating ripple effects throughout the regional economy. The mysterious figure who seemed to be protecting the animals had become a threat to the livelihood of hundreds of families, and the situation demanded immediate action. Among the most affected hunters was a man named Shamhat, whose family had worked the same territories for generations. His traps had been destroyed repeatedly, his hunting grounds had been systematically cleared of game, and his attempts to track the mysterious saboteur had proven futile. The economic pressure on his household had reached a breaking point, forcing him to consider abandoning the profession that had sustained his ancestors for centuries. However, before giving up entirely, he decided to make one final attempt to resolve the crisis through direct confrontation. Shamhat's plan involved a carefully orchestrated expedition designed to locate and capture the wilderness guardian who had been disrupting hunting activities. He assembled a group of experienced hunters and trackers, men who knew the steppes intimately and possessed the skills necessary to locate even the most elusive quarry. The expedition was equipped with nets, ropes, and other capture devices, as the hunters hoped to take their target alive for questioning about his motivations and methods. The search party spent weeks combing the wilderness areas where the mysterious interventions had been most frequent. They followed every track, investigated every disturbed trap site, and questioned nomadic herders who might have encountered the elusive figure. Their persistence eventually paid off when they discovered a pattern in the destruction activities that suggested the saboteur was operating from a base camp located near a particular cluster of natural springs. This discovery allowed them to narrow their search to a manageable area and begin systematic surveillance of the suspected location. The hunters' first actual sighting of Enkidu occurred at dawn on a day when the morning mist provided perfect cover for observation. They watched from concealed positions as a massive figure emerged from a rocky shelter and began his daily routine of checking on nearby animal herds. His appearance was even more striking than the various descriptions they had heard from other hunters. His enormous frame moved with surprising grace and silence, and his obvious comfort among the wild animals confirmed that they had found their target. The initial plan had been to capture Enkidu through stealth and overwhelming numbers, but the hunters quickly realized that conventional methods would be inadequate. His extraordinary senses detected their presence despite their careful concealment, and his physical capabilities clearly exceeded anything they had encountered before. When he became aware of their surveillance, his reaction was not fear or flight, but a calm assessment of the threat they represented. The hunters found themselves being observed by their intended prey, a reversal that left them uncertain about how to proceed. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Enkidu approached the hunters' position with deliberate steps, making no attempt to conceal his movements or appear non-threatening. His massive frame and wild appearance created an intimidating presence that caused several of the hunters to reconsider their involvement in the expedition. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone completely confident in his ability to handle any situation that might develop. Enkidu's communication with the hunters revealed both his intelligence and his fundamental disconnection from human society. He understood their language perfectly, but seemed puzzled by their motivations and methods. His questions about why they needed to kill animals when the wilderness provided abundant plant foods demonstrated his lack of understanding about agricultural societies and their dependence on animal products. The hunter's explanations about economic necessity and cultural traditions made little impression on him, as these concepts had no relevance to his own existence. The negotiation that developed between Enkidu and the hunters highlighted the fundamental incompatibility between his worldview and theirs. He offered to help them find alternative food sources and to teach them methods of wilderness survival that would reduce their dependence on hunting. The hunters, while impressed by his obvious knowledge and abilities, explained that their communities required animal products for purposes beyond mere survival. Leather for clothing and tools, bones for implements, and meat for trade were essential components of their economic system that could not be replaced by plant alternatives. The deadlock in these negotiations led Shamhat to propose a different approach. Rather than attempting to force Enkidu to abandon his protective activities, he suggested introducing him to the broader human community to help him understand the complex relationships between civilization and wilderness resources. This proposal intrigued Enkidu, who had never seen a city or experienced the organized society that existed beyond the steppes. His curiosity about human civilization had been growing during his years in the wilderness, fueled by his interactions with hunters and the glimpses of settled life he had observed from a distance. Shamhat's invitation to visit Uruk represented a crucial turning point in Enkidu's existence. The decision to leave his wilderness home and enter human society was not made lightly, as it meant abandoning the animals he had protected and the environment where he had found purpose and meaning. However, his growing isolation and his desire to understand the human world that seemed so different from his own ultimately convinced him to accept the invitation. The journey to Uruk would expose him to experiences and challenges that would transform his understanding of both himself and the world around him. The transition from wilderness to civilization proved more difficult than Enkidu had anticipated. His first encounters with agricultural settlements revealed the extent of human modification of the natural environment. Fields of cultivated grain stretched across landscapes that had once supported wild plant communities, while irrigation canals channeled water resources that had previously flowed freely to support natural ecosystems. The systematic organization of human settlements, with their clearly defined boundaries and specialized functions, contrasted sharply with the organic patterns of wilderness life. Enkidu's physical appearance and behavior marked him as an outsider in every human community he encountered during the journey to Uruk. His wild hair and primitive clothing drew stares and whispers from settled peoples who had never seen anyone living in such a natural state. His unfamiliarity with basic social conventions created awkward situations that highlighted his complete separation from civilized life. Simple activities like eating prepared food or sleeping in enclosed spaces proved challenging for someone accustomed to the complete freedom of wilderness existence. The gradual process of Enkidu's introduction to human society involved learning not just practical skills, but entire systems of meaning and value that governed civilized life. The concept of property ownership, fundamental to agricultural societies, was particularly difficult for him to understand. His wilderness experience had taught him that resources belonged to whoever needed them most at any given moment, while human society operated on principles of permanent ownership and exclusive control. These conflicting worldviews created tensions that would influence his later interactions with urban civilization. The social dynamics of human communities also presented challenges for Enkidu's integration. His direct communication style and lack of familiarity with social hierarchies led to misunderstandings and conflicts with people who expected more conventional behavior. His physical strength and imposing presence commanded respect, but his ignorance of cultural norms created situations where that respect was mixed with fear and suspicion. The journey to Uruk became a crash course in human social behavior that tested his adaptability and intelligence. As the travelling party approached Uruk, Enkidu's first glimpse of the great city provided a shocking introduction to the scale and complexity of human civilization. The massive walls that surrounded the urban core rose higher than any natural formation he had encountered in the wilderness, while the smoke from countless hearths and workshops created a haze that obscured the horizon. The sound of human activity, voices, tools, animals, and machinery, created a constant background noise that contrasted sharply with the natural sounds of the steppes. The entry into Uruk itself overwhelmed Enkidu's senses with the intensity of urban life. The narrow streets teemed with people engaged in activities he'd never imagined, from craft production to commerce to religious ceremonies. The density of human population within the city walls exceeded anything he had thought possible, while the variety of occupations and social roles demonstrated the complexity of civilized society. The smells, sounds, and visual stimuli of urban life created a sensory overload that left him struggling to process the information flooding his consciousness. Enkidu's arrival in Uruk coincided with preparations for a royal wedding, an event that would provide his first direct encounter with Gilgamesh's tyrannical behavior. The celebration was intended to be a joyous occasion marking the union of two prominent families, but the king's assertion of jus primae noctis had transformed it into a source of community tension and resentment. The bride's family faced the humiliation of seeing their daughter subjected to royal privilege before she could join her chosen husband, while the groom's family struggled with the insult to their honour and status. The wedding preparations revealed the systematic nature of Gilgamesh's oppression and its impact on Uruk's social fabric. What should have been a celebration involving the entire community had become a source of division and fear. Families with marriageable daughters lived in constant anxiety about when they might face similar demands, while young men wondered whether they would ever be able to establish normal family relationships. The king's behaviour had corrupted one of society's most fundamental institutions, turning marriage from a source of joy and stability into an instrument of royal domination. Enkidu's reaction to learning about the Jus Primae Noctis was immediate and visceral. His wilderness upbringing had taught him to protect the vulnerable and to oppose any form of unnecessary cruelty or exploitation. The idea that a ruler would use his power to violate the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives struck him as fundamentally wrong, contradicting every principle of natural justice he had learned during his years among the animals. His moral outrage was intensified by his growing understanding of how marriage functioned in human society and the damage that Gilgamesh's behaviour was causing to community relationships. The specific wedding that brought Enkidu into direct conflict with Gilgamesh involved a young woman whose family had tried desperately to avoid the royal attention. They had attempted to conduct the ceremony quietly, hoping to complete the marriage before the king learned of their plans. However, Gilgamesh's network of informants had discovered their intentions, and royal guards had been dispatched to ensure that the king's privileges were respected. The confrontation that was building would pit Enkidu's natural sense of justice against the established power structure of Uruk. The wedding procession that Enkidu encountered was a study in contrast between public celebration and private anguish. The formal aspects of the ceremony proceeded according to ancient traditions, with music, dancing and ritual offerings that honoured the gods and celebrated the union of two families. However, the underlying tension was palpable, as everyone present understood that the evening would bring not consummation of the marriage, but royal violation of the bride. The forced smiles and hollow congratulations reflected a community going through the motions of celebration while experiencing collective trauma. Enkidu's decision to intervene in the wedding crisis was not impulsive, but reflected his fundamental character and values. His years of protecting animals from human predators had taught him to recognize exploitation and to act decisively against it. The situation in Uruk represented the same pattern on a larger scale, with a powerful individual using his advantages to harm those who could not defend themselves. His moral framework, developed through direct experience of natural justice, left him no choice but to oppose Gilgamesh's tyrannical behaviour. Confrontation began when Enkidu positioned himself in the path of the royal procession that was approaching the wedding site. His massive frame and wild appearance created an immediate sensation among the crowd, many of whom had never seen anyone like him. The royal guards, accustomed to dealing with ordinary citizens who offered no resistance to the king's demands, found themselves facing an opponent whose physical presence suggested capabilities far beyond normal human limits. The tension in the air was electric as two forces prepared to clash in the streets of Uruk. Gilgamesh's arrival at the scene created a moment of recognition that would define both characters for the rest of their lives. The king, expecting to find the usual cowering submission that greeted his appearances, instead encountered someone who showed no fear or deference. Enkidu's steady gaze and confident posture communicated a challenge that Gilgamesh had never faced before. For the first time in his reign, the king found himself confronting someone who appeared to be his equal in strength, and who clearly intended to oppose his will. The initial exchange between the two giants was conducted without words, as each assessed the other's capabilities and intentions. Gilgamesh's divine heritage had given him confidence that no mortal could match his strength, while Enkidu's wilderness experience had taught him to evaluate threats accurately and respond appropriately. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation sensed that they were about to observe something unprecedented in the history of their city. The battle that erupted between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was unlike anything the citizens of Uruk had ever witnessed. Two beings of superhuman strength grappled in the narrow streets. their combat creating a spectacle that combined the raw power of natural forces with the skill and intelligence of exceptional warriors. The sound of their struggle echoed off the city walls, while the ground trembled under the impact of their movements. Buildings shook as the combatants crashed into walls and doorways, their battle raging across multiple city blocks as neither could gain a decisive advantage. The techniques employed by each fighter reflected their different backgrounds and training. Gilgamesh fought with the refined skills of a warrior king, using holds and throws that had been perfected through years of military training and combat experience. His movements showed the discipline and precision of someone who had studied the arts of war under expert instruction. Enkidu, by contrast, relied on the raw power and instinctive reactions that had been developed through years of survival in the wilderness. His fighting style was less polished but equally effective, combining human intelligence with the fierce determination of a wild animal defending its territory. The battle continued for hours, with neither combatant able to achieve victory over the other. Their strength proved to be perfectly matched, creating a stalemate that tested both their physical capabilities and their mental resolve. The crowd that had initially gathered to watch the spectacle gradually realized that they were witnessing something more than a simple fight. The equal struggle between the two giants suggested that Gilgamesh had finally met his match, a possibility that had seemed impossible given his previous dominance over all challengers. The exhaustion that finally ended the titanic struggle between Gilgamesh and Enkidu left both warriors sprawled in the dust of Uruk's central plaza, their bodies bearing the marks of combat that had lasted from dawn until sunset. Neither had achieved victory, but both had discovered something more valuable than triumph, the existence of an equal. As they lay gasping for breath, their eyes met with mutual recognition of strength and worth that transcended the conflict that had brought them together. The crowd that had witnessed their battle stood in stunned silence, understanding that they had observed a transformation that would alter the course of their city's history. The recovery period that followed their confrontation allowed both men to assess what they had learned about each other. Gilgamesh, accustomed to effortless dominance over all opponents, found himself genuinely impressed by Enkidu's raw power and fighting instincts. The wild man's techniques, while unrefined by civilized standards, had proven devastatingly effective against even the most skilled combat methods. More importantly, Enkidu's willingness to risk everything to protect the innocent had demonstrated a moral courage that the king had rarely encountered among his subjects. Enkidu, for his part, recognized in Gilgamesh a warrior whose abilities matched his own, but whose potential had been corrupted by isolation and unchecked power. The king's fighting skills revealed intelligence and discipline that commanded respect, while his obvious loneliness suggested a man who had been denied the companionship necessary for emotional and moral development. The wild man's years of protecting animals from human predators had taught him to distinguish between those who killed from necessity and those who caused suffering for pleasure, and he sensed that Gilgamesh belonged to neither category, but rather to a third group, those who had lost their way through circumstances beyond their control. The friendship that developed between the two warriors emerged gradually through shared experiences and mutual respect. Their initial conversations, conducted while their wounds healed, revealed the extent of their complementary natures. Gilgamesh possessed knowledge of history, politics and culture that fascinated Enkidu, while the wild man's understanding of natural processes and animal behavior opened new perspectives for the king. Their discussions often lasted through the night, as each discovered in the other a mind capable of matching his own intellectual intensity. The transformation in Gilgamesh's behavior toward his subjects began almost immediately after his encounter with Enkidu. The presence of a true equal in his life provided the emotional anchor that had been missing since his childhood, when his divine heritage had begun to separate him from normal human relationships. The king's previous cruelty had stemmed not from inherent evil, but from the psychological damage caused by absolute power exercised in complete isolation. Enkidu's friendship offered him the first genuine human connection he had experienced since ascending to the throne, creating the foundation for moral growth and self-reflection. The citizens of Uruk observed these changes with cautious optimism, uncertain whether the king's apparent reformation would prove lasting or merely temporary. The cessation of the jus primae noctis was the most immediately visible sign of transformation, as royal guards stopped appearing at wedding ceremonies and families could once again celebrate marriages without fear of royal interference. The excessive labour demands that had disrupted agricultural cycles were also reduced, allowing the population to return to normal patterns of work and rest that supported both individual welfare and community prosperity. However, the most significant change in Gilgamesh's character was his growing restlessness and desire for meaningful challenges. The satisfaction he'd previously derived from dominating his subjects had been replaced by a hunger for adventures that would test his abilities against worthy opponents. His friendship with Enkidu had awakened ambitions that extended beyond the boundaries of Uruk, creating dreams of achievements that would earn genuine glory rather than mere fear and submission. The idea of journeying to the cedar forest first emerged during one of their lengthy conversations about the nature of heroism and the proper use of exceptional abilities. Enkidu's stories of the wilderness had included references to distant mountains where enormous trees grew in groves, protected by supernatural guardians. These tales sparked Gilgamesh's imagination, as he envisioned expeditions that would take them far from the familiar territories around Uruk into lands where their strength and courage would face genuine tests. The cedar forest, known to the people of Mesopotamia as a source of the precious timber essential for major construction projects, lay in the mountain ranges that would later be called the Lebanon Mountains. The cedars that grew there were unlike any trees found in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, reaching heights of over 100 feet and possessing wood of extraordinary durability and beauty. The resin-rich timber was prized for its resistance to decay and insects, making it the preferred material for temple construction, royal palaces, and the most important ceremonial objects. The economic value of cedarwood had made it a crucial trade commodity throughout the ancient Near East, but obtaining it required expeditions that few rulers were willing to undertake. The forest's location in remote mountain valleys meant that transportation costs were enormous, while the difficult terrain and harsh climate made the journey dangerous even for well-equipped parties. More significantly, the forest was said to be protected by Humbaba, a monstrous guardian whose presence had discouraged most attempts at large-scale timber harvesting. Humbaba's reputation as a fearsome supernatural being had grown through generations of storytelling, but the core of these tales was based on genuine encounters with a creature of extraordinary power and malevolence. Descriptions of the monster varied in detail, but all agreed on his enormous size, his command of natural forces, and his absolute hostility toward human intruders. Some accounts portrayed him as a giant with the head of a lion and the body of a man, while others described him as a creature of living fire whose breath could kill at a distance. The decision to mount an expedition against Humbaba represented more than simple adventure-seeking for Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The king saw the mission as an opportunity to demonstrate that his reformed character had not diminished his courage or capabilities, while also securing valuable resources for Uruk's continued prosperity. The cedar timber would enable construction projects that would benefit the entire population, transforming the expedition from a personal quest into a service to the community. For Enkidu, the journey offered a chance to test his wilderness skills in an environment more challenging than the familiar steppes, while also supporting his friend's desire to achieve something worthy of his abilities. The planning phase of the expedition required careful consideration of logistics, equipment, and personnel. The distance to the cedar forest meant that the party would need to carry supplies for several weeks of travel through terrain that offered limited opportunities for resupply. The mountainous environment would require specialized equipment for climbing and camping, while the anticipated confrontation with Humbaba demanded weapons and armour of the highest quality. The expedition would also need skilled guides familiar with the route and experienced porters capable of carrying the heavy loads necessary for such an ambitious undertaking. The weapon forging process that preceded the expedition represented one of the most significant metallurgical undertakings in Uruk's history. The city's master craftsmen, working under direct royal supervision, created arms and armour specifically designed for the challenges that Gilgamesh and Enkidu would face. The weapons needed to be not only exceptionally sharp and durable, but also capable of inflicting damage on a supernatural opponent whose nature remained largely unknown. The smiths experimented with new alloys and forging techniques, creating blades that combined the hardness necessary for cutting through tough materials with the flexibility required to withstand the stresses of extended combat. The axes that were forged for the expedition were massive two-handed weapons weighing nearly 200 pounds each, designed to take advantage of the warriors' superhuman strength. The blades were made from the finest bronze available, alloyed with tin imported from distant lands, and worked by smiths who had perfected their craft over decades of royal service. The handles were carved from the hardest wood available and reinforced with bronze fittings that would prevent breakage under the extreme stresses of combat. The finished weapons were works of art as well as instruments of war, decorated with intricate patterns that honoured the gods and proclaimed the bearer's royal status. The swords created for the expedition were equally impressive, featuring blades over 4 feet in length that could serve as both cutting and thrusting weapons. The metallurgy involved in creating such large blades required techniques that pushed the boundaries of Bronze Age technology, with careful attention to heat treatment and tempering that would ensure the weapons would not shatter under combat stress. The hilts were designed to accommodate the warrior's large hands while providing the grip security necessary for extended fighting, wrapped in leather that had been specially treated to prevent slipping even when wet with blood or perspiration. The armour crafted for Gilgamesh and Enkidu combined protection with mobility, recognising that their fighting style depended on speed and agility rather than passive defence. The bronze scales were individually shaped and fitted to create flexible coverage that would turn aside most weapons while allowing full freedom of movement. The helmets were designed to protect the head and neck without restricting vision or hearing, featuring reinforced sections that could withstand heavy blows while maintaining the balance necessary for rapid movement in combat. The religious preparations for the expedition were as important as the physical ones, reflecting the Mesopotamian understanding that success in dangerous undertakings required divine support. The primary deity invoked for the mission was Shamash, the sun god whose domain included justice, law, and the protection of travellers. Shamash's blessing was considered essential for any expedition that would take the warriors beyond the familiar territories where their local gods held sway, as his solar authority extended across all lands touched by sunlight. The ritual ceremonies conducted to secure Shamash's blessing involved elaborate offerings and prayers that emphasized the expedition's noble purposes. The priests emphasized that the mission was not motivated by greed or conquest, but by the desire to serve the community and to test the warrior's abilities against a worthy opponent. The cedar wood that would be obtained from the forest would be used for temple construction and other projects that would honour the gods and benefit the people of Uruk. The defeat of Umbaba would remove a threat to future expeditions and open new opportunities for trade and exploration. The specific rituals performed for Shamash included the sacrifice of bulls and the offering of precious oils and incense that would carry the prayers to the god's celestial realm. The ceremonies were conducted at dawn, when Shamash's power was strongest and his attention was focused on the earthly realm. The priests recited ancient formulas that invoked the god's protection against supernatural enemies and his guidance through unknown territories. The warriors themselves participated in purification rituals that would prepare them spiritually for the challenges ahead, including fasting and meditation that would focus their minds on the sacred nature of their mission. The departure from Uruk was marked by ceremonies that involved the entire population, as the citizens gathered to witness the beginning of an expedition that would test their reformed king and his wild companion. The procession that carried the warriors to the city gates included musicians, priests, and representatives of every craft guild, creating a celebration that honoured both the expedition's goals and the courage of its participants. The weapons and armour were displayed prominently, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun and symbolising the divine favour that the ceremonies had sought to secure. The route to the cedar forest led through territories that neither Gilgamesh nor Enkidu had previously explored, requiring careful navigation and constant vigilance against both natural hazards and human enemies. The first portion of the journey crossed the familiar agricultural lands surrounding Uruk, where irrigation canals and cultivated fields provided evidence of human control over the natural environment. However, as the expedition moved farther from the city, the landscape gradually became wilder and more challenging, with rocky hills and sparse vegetation that tested both the warriors' endurance and their ability to find adequate supplies. The transition from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the foothills of the Lebanon mountains required adjustments in travel techniques and equipment use. The flat terrain that had allowed rapid movement on foot gave way to steep slopes and rocky paths that demanded careful attention to footing and balance. The climate also changed dramatically, with the hot, dry conditions of the lowlands replaced by cooler temperatures and increased humidity that affected both the warriors' physical comfort and the condition of their equipment. The wildlife encountered during the journey was unlike anything either warrior had previously faced, including species that had adapted to the mountain environment and possessed capabilities that made them formidable opponents. Mountain lions, bears, and wolves posed constant threats to the expedition, while venomous snakes and insects created additional hazards that required constant vigilance. The hunting opportunities were also different from those available in the familiar territories around Uruk, with game animals that were more elusive and required different tracking techniques. The approach to the cedar forest itself was marked by increasingly ominous signs that suggested the presence of supernatural forces. The animal life became scarce and nervous, with birds and small mammals displaying behaviour that indicated their fear of some unseen threat. The vegetation showed signs of damage that could not be explained by normal environmental factors, with trees bearing scorch marks and areas of ground that appeared to have been burned by intense heat. The air itself seemed to carry a sense of menace that affected both warriors despite their courage and determination. The first sight of the cedar forest was both magnificent and terrifying, as the enormous trees stretched across mountain valleys in formations that seemed to defy natural growth patterns. The cedars themselves were larger than any trees the warriors had previously encountered, with trunks that would require dozens of men to encircle, and branches that created a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The silence within the forest was unnatural and oppressive, broken only by occasional sounds that seemed to come from no identifiable source. The search for Humbaba required careful exploration of the forest's most remote sections, where the Guardian was said to make his dwelling. The warriors moved through the undergrowth with weapons ready, their senses alert for any sign of the monster's presence. The tracks they discovered were unlike anything in their experience, showing claw marks and footprints that indicated a creature of enormous size and power. The destruction visible in some areas suggested that Humbaba's rage could devastate entire sections of the forest when aroused. The confrontation with Humbaba began with the monster's roar, a sound that echoed through the mountains and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The creature that emerged from the forest depths was even more terrifying than the legends had suggested, standing nearly 20 feet tall with features that combined human intelligence with bestial ferocity. His body was covered in scales that gleamed like bronze armour, while his eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to penetrate the warriors' souls. His breath created clouds of superheated air that withered vegetation and made the surrounding atmosphere almost unbearable. The battle that followed tested every skill and technique that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had developed during their years of training and combat experience. Humbaba's size and strength exceeded even their superhuman capabilities, while his command of natural forces allowed him to call upon wind, fire, and earth as weapons against his opponents. The monster's claws could shred bronze armor as easily as cloth, while his breath could kill at distances that made conventional weapons ineffective. The warriors were forced to rely on speed, coordination, and tactical intelligence to compensate for their disadvantages in raw power. The turning point in the battle came when Enkidu managed to distract Humbaba long enough for Gilgamesh to deliver a crippling blow to the monster's legs, reducing his mobility and forcing him to fight from a defensive position. The creature's wounded roars brought avalanches cascading down the mountainsides, while his thrashing movements uprooted trees and carved new channels in the rocky ground. However, his reduced mobility allowed the warriors to coordinate their attacks more effectively, gradually wearing down his defenses through sustained assault. As defeat became inevitable, Humbaba's demeanor changed from fierce aggression to desperate pleading as he begged for mercy and offered to serve the warriors as a guardian of the forest under their authority. His appeals emphasized his role as a protector of the natural world and his willingness to share the forest's resources with humans who approached with proper respect. The monster's pleas revealed an intelligence and emotional depth that complicated the warriors' understanding of their mission and raised questions about the morality of their actions. The decision to execute Humbaba despite his pleas for mercy represented a crucial moral choice that would have lasting consequences for both warriors. Gilgamesh, influenced by his royal training and his desire to complete the mission successfully, argued for killing the monster to ensure that future expeditions would not face the same threat. Enkidu, whose wilderness experience had taught him to respect the natural order and to avoid unnecessary killing, initially favoured sparing Humbaba's life in exchange for his cooperation. The debate between them revealed fundamental differences in their worldviews and their understanding of justice and necessity. The final blow that ended Humbaba's life was delivered jointly by both warriors, symbolising their shared responsibility for the decision and its consequences. The monster's death was accompanied by supernatural phenomena that suggested the cosmic significance of their action, including earthquakes, storms, and the appearance of omens that would later be interpreted as warnings from the gods. The silence that followed Humbaba's death was profound and unsettling, as if the forest itself was mourning the loss of its guardian and contemplating the implications of human intrusion into the natural order. The aftermath of Humbaba's death left Gilgamesh and Enkidu standing in the eerie silence of the cedar forest, their weapons dripping with the monster's dark blood, while supernatural winds howled through the ancient trees. The ground beneath their feet trembled with aftershocks that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the earth, as if the natural world itself was responding to the Guardian's violent end. The cedar trees, which had stood for millennia under Humbaba's protection, now swayed ominously in the unnatural breeze, their massive branches creaking with sounds that resembled mournful laments. The two warriors began the arduous task of selecting and harvesting the finest cedar trees, their axes biting deep into wood that had never known human touch. Each stroke echoed through the mountain valleys with a resonance that seemed to carry far beyond the physical realm, announcing to gods and mortals alike that the ancient barrier between civilization and the primordial wilderness had been shattered. The cedar wood itself was unlike anything found in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, its grain tight and resinous, filled with aromatic oils that would preserve it for centuries to come. The return journey to Uruk was triumphant, yet tinged with an undercurrent of unease that neither warrior could fully articulate. The precious cedar logs they transported would provide material for temples and palaces that would stand as monuments to their achievement. but the memory of Humbaba's final pleas continued to haunt their thoughts. The supernatural phenomena that had accompanied the monster's death had not ceased with their departure from the forest, as strange dreams and ominous portents followed them across the mountain passes and down into the familiar territories of home. The citizens of Uruk greeted their returning heroes with celebrations that lasted for days, as the successful completion of such a dangerous mission elevated both Gilgamesh and Enkidu to legendary status among their people. The cedar wood was immediately put to use in construction projects that would beautify the city and honour the gods, while craftsmen competed for the privilege of working with timber that had been won through such extraordinary courage and skill. The weapons and armour that had served them in battle against Humbaba were displayed in the royal palace as trophies of their victory, their bronze surfaces polished to mirror brightness that reflected the glory of their achievement. However, the divine realm had taken notice of the warriors' actions in the cedar forest, and the gods' response would prove far more complex and dangerous than either hero could have anticipated. The killing of Humbaba had disrupted the cosmic balance that governed the relationship between civilization and the natural world, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of their victory. The monster had not been merely a guardian of trees, but a crucial component in the divine order that regulated human expansion and maintained the boundaries between the mortal and supernatural realms. The news of Humbaba's death reached the goddess Ishtar as she observed the celebrations in Uruk from her celestial palace, her divine senses attuned to the shifting currents of power and influence that flowed through the mortal world. The sight of Gilgamesh at the height of his glory, his body bronzed by the mountain sun and his frame enhanced by the confidence that came from overcoming seemingly impossible challenges, stirred desires within the goddess that transcended her usual interactions with mortal men. His transformation from tyrant to hero had created a figure of such compelling attraction that even the Queen of Heaven found herself drawn to his presence. Ishtar's interest in Gilgamesh was not merely physical, but encompassed the political and cosmic implications of an alliance between the greatest goddess of Mesopotamia and the most successful king of his generation. Such a union would create a partnership that could reshape the balance of power between the divine and mortal realms, while also providing the goddess with a mortal champion whose achievements already rivaled those of legendary heroes. The timing seemed perfect, as Gilgamesh's recent victories had elevated him to a status that made him worthy of divine attention, while his friendship with Enkidu had demonstrated his capacity for loyalty and emotional depth. The goddess began her approach to Gilgamesh with careful calculation, appearing to him in dreams and visions that gradually intensified his awareness of her presence and interest. Her initial manifestations were subtle, taking the form of favourable omens and supernatural assistance that aided his daily activities as king. The harvests in Uruk's territories proved exceptionally abundant. Trade negotiations concluded with unusual success, and potential military threats dissolved without requiring armed intervention. These blessings were accompanied by increasingly vivid dreams in which Ishtar appeared in various forms, each more beautiful and alluring than the last. The goddess's physical appearance when she finally revealed herself to Gilgamesh was calculated to overwhelm his senses and cloud his judgment with desire. She manifested in her aspect as the goddess of love and beauty, her form radiating an otherworldly perfection that surpassed any mortal woman's attractiveness. Her skin possessed the luminous quality of polished ivory, while her hair fell in waves of deepest black that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Her eyes held the depth of night skies filled with stars, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated with frequencies beyond normal human hearing. The garments that adorned Ishtar's divine form were woven from materials that existed only in the celestial realm, fabrics that shifted colour and texture with her movements and seemed to be composed of captured starlight and crystallized moonbeams. Precious stones that had never been seen on Earth decorated her clothing and jewellery, their surfaces reflecting images of distant worlds and cosmic phenomena that spoke of her dominion over realms beyond mortal comprehension. The very air around her shimmered with power, creating an aura of supernatural authority that commanded both reverence and desire. Ishtar's proposition to Gilgamesh was delivered with the confidence of a goddess accustomed to having her desires fulfilled without question or hesitation. She offered him not merely her physical affections, but a partnership that would elevate him beyond the limitations of mortal existence, promising him dominion over territories that extended far beyond the boundaries of earthly kingdoms. Her words painted visions of cosmic adventures and supernatural achievements that would make his victory over Humbaba seem like a minor preliminary to greater glories that awaited their union. The gifts that Ishtar promised to bestow upon Gilgamesh reflected the vast scope of her divine powers and the resources at her disposal. She offered him a chariot crafted from precious metals and gemstones that would carry him across the heavens as easily as earthly roads, drawn by creatures that combined the strength of lions with the speed of eagles. His palace would be expanded to rival the dwellings of the gods themselves, with rooms that opened onto gardens where every flower bloomed eternally and every tree bore fruit that granted extended youth to those who consumed it. The military advantages that would accompany their alliance were equally impressive, as Ishtar commanded legions of supernatural warriors who could ensure victory in any conflict that might arise. Kings and princes from distant lands would seek Gilgamesh's favour, bringing tribute and homage that would make Uruk the centre of her empire stretching from the sunrise to the sunset. The goddess's influence over fertility and abundance would ensure that his territories produced harvests that could feed vast populations while generating surplus wealth that would fund any project or ambition he might conceive. However, Gilgamesh's response to Ishtar's proposition revealed the wisdom and moral growth that had resulted from his friendship with Enkidu and his experiences in the cedar forest. Rather than being overwhelmed by the goddess's beauty and the magnificence of her promises, he found himself analysing her offer with the careful attention of a ruler who had learned to consider the long-term consequences of his decisions. The memory of Humbaba's final pleas had sensitized him to the dangers of actions that might appear beneficial in the immediate term, but could create unforeseen problems in the future. The king's rejection of Ishtar's advances was not delivered with the diplomatic evasions that might have been expected from a mortal addressing a powerful deity, but with the direct honesty that had characterized his relationship with Enkidu. He acknowledged the goddess's beauty and the attractiveness of her offers, but proceeded to catalogue the fate of her previous lovers with a precision that demonstrated his thorough knowledge of divine mythology and his understanding of the patterns that governed Ishtar's romantic relationships. Gilgamesh's recitation of Ishtar's romantic history began with Tammuz, the shepherd god, who had been her most famous consort, and whose fate had become a cautionary tale throughout the ancient Near East. The king described how the goddess's initial passion for Tammuz had led to a period of intense happiness and mutual devotion, but how her affections had eventually cooled and transformed into the cruel indifference that characterized her treatment of discarded lovers. Tammuz's condemnation to spend half of each year in the underworld was not the result of external forces, but of Ishtar's own decision to sacrifice him to preserve her own divine status. The catalogue continued with the bird catcher, who had served Ishtar faithfully until his usefulness ended, at which point the goddess had transformed him into a mole condemned to live in perpetual darkness beneath the earth. The gardener who had tended her sacred groves had been changed into a frog when his devotion began to bore her, while the lion who had been her companion in hunting expeditions had been trapped in pitfalls of her own devising when his strength began to rival her own. Each example demonstrated the same pattern of initial favour followed by inevitable abandonment and cruel punishment. The shepherd who had provided Ishtar with the finest offerings from his flocks had been transformed into a wolf, condemned to be hunted by the very dogs that had once protected his herds. The horse trainer who had bred the swiftest steeds for her chariot had been changed into a stallion and broken to the harness, forced to serve in the very capacity he had once supervised. The examples multiplied as Gilgamesh's memory drew upon the extensive mythological knowledge that formed part of every Mesopotamian king's education, each story reinforcing the pattern of divine fickleness and mortal suffering that characterized the goddess's romantic relationships. The psychological insight that Gilgamesh demonstrated in his analysis of Ishtar's behavior revealed the depth of understanding he'd gained through his friendship with Enkidu and his experiences as a reformed ruler. He recognized that the goddess's pattern of behavior stemmed not from malice but from the fundamental incompatibility between divine nature and mortal needs. Her immortal existence made it impossible for her to sustain the kind of long-term commitment that meaningful relationships required, while her unlimited power removed the constraints that forced mortals to consider the consequences of their actions. The king's rejection was delivered with the respectful but firm tone of a ruler who had learned to balance diplomatic necessity with personal integrity. He acknowledged Ishtar's divine status and expressed gratitude for her interest, but made clear that he understood the inevitable consequences of accepting her proposition. His analysis demonstrated not only his intelligence, but his moral growth, as he chose to forego immediate pleasure and advancement in favour of preserving his autonomy and protecting himself from the fate that had befallen the goddess's previous lovers. The goddess's reaction to Gilgamesh's rejection was immediate and volcanic, as her divine pride struggled to process the unprecedented experience of being refused by a mortal. Her beauty transformed into terrifying majesty as her true nature revealed itself, with eyes that blazed like furnaces and a voice that carried the power of storms and earthquakes. The air around her crackled with supernatural energy that made the very stones of the palace tremble, while her presence seemed to expand until it filled the entire throne room with an aura of barely contained cosmic force. Ishtar's rage was not merely personal but cosmic in scope, as Gilgamesh's rejection represented a challenge to the divine order that governed the relationship between gods and mortals. Throughout the history of Mesopotamian civilization, no human had ever refused the advances of a major deity, and the precedent that Gilgamesh was setting threatened to undermine the fundamental assumptions about divine authority and mortal subservience that maintained the stability of the cosmic hierarchy. The goddess's fury was therefore both a personal response to wounded pride and a defensive reaction to protect the established order. The immediate target of Ishtar's wrath was not Gilgamesh himself, as direct action against him would have required justification that even her divine status could not provide, without risking conflict with other gods who might view such punishment as excessive. Instead, she directed her fury toward her father Anu, the supreme god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, demanding that he provide her with the means to punish Gilgamesh indirectly through the destruction of his city and people. Her appeal to Anu represented an escalation of the conflict that would test the stability of the divine hierarchy itself. The goddess's journey to the celestial realm where Anu held court was marked by supernatural phenomena that announced her approach to every god and spirit in the divine hierarchy. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend around her passage, with stars shifting in their courses and cosmic winds carrying the scent of her rage across infinite distances. Her arrival at Anu's palace created tremors that shook the foundations of heaven itself, while her demands for justice echoed through the celestial halls with a force that compelled attention from every divine being within the cosmic order. Ishtar's petition to her father combined personal grievance with theological argument, as she portrayed Gilgamesh's rejection not merely as an insult to her dignity, but as a fundamental challenge to divine authority that required immediate and decisive response. She argued that allowing a mortal to refuse a goddess's advances without consequence would encourage similar acts of defiance throughout the human world, ultimately undermining the respect and reverence that maintained the proper relationship between the divine and mortal realms. Her demand for the Bull of Heaven represented not merely a request for a weapon of destruction, but an appeal for the restoration of cosmic order through the demonstration of divine power. The Bull of Heaven that Anu reluctantly released from the celestial realm was a creature of such devastating power that its very existence threatened the stability of the natural order. When the massive beast materialized in the fields outside Uruk, its hooves struck the earth with such force that cracks appeared in the ground for miles in every direction, while its breath created scorching winds that withered crops and dried up irrigation channels. The bull's hide gleamed like polished bronze, impervious to conventional weapons, while its eyes burned with the same divine fire that had once blazed in Humbaba's gaze. Its horns, each longer than a man's body, could gore through the strongest fortifications as easily as a knife-piercing cloth. The destruction that followed the bull's arrival was systematic and merciless. The creature's rampage through Uruk's agricultural districts destroyed years of careful cultivation in a matter of hours, trampling grain fields and demolishing the complex irrigation systems that had sustained the city's population for generations. The economic foundation of Gilgamesh's kingdom crumbled under the beast's assault as storage facilities were crushed and trade routes became impassable due to the fissures that opened in the earth wherever the bull's hooves touched the ground. The carefully maintained balance between urban civilization and agricultural production that had made Uruk prosperous was shattered by divine wrath given physical form. The human cost of the bull's assault was staggering, as hundreds of citizens died in the initial attack and thousands more found themselves homeless and destitute. The creature's supernatural strength allowed it to demolish entire city blocks with single blows, while its fiery breath created infernos that consumed everything in their path. The screams of the dying and the crash of collapsing buildings created a cacophony of destruction that could be heard for miles, while the smoke from burning structures darkened the sky and blocked out the sun's light. The pride and prosperity that had characterized Uruk under Gilgamesh's reformed rule were replaced by terror and desperation as the city's inhabitants fled before the divine punishment that had been unleashed upon them. The battle that Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought against the Bull of Heaven required every skill and technique they had developed during their partnership, as they faced an opponent whose power exceeded even Humbaba's formidable capabilities. The creature's size made conventional combat tactics ineffective, while its supernatural nature rendered many of their weapons useless against its bronze-like hide. The warriors were forced to rely on speed and coordination, using their knowledge of each other's fighting styles to create opportunities for attack while avoiding the bull's devastating charges and the scorching heat of its breath. The turning point in the battle came when Enkidu managed to grasp the bull's massive horns, using his superhuman strength to wrestle the creature to a standstill, while Gilgamesh delivered the killing blow with his great sword. The beast's death throes were accompanied by earthquakes and lightning strikes that announced to the divine realm that their instrument of punishment had been defeated by mortal hands. The bull's body dissolved into golden dust that scattered on the wind, leaving behind only the memory of destruction and the knowledge that even divine wrath could be overcome by courage and friendship working in perfect harmony. However, the victory over the Bull of Heaven proved to be Pyrrhic, as the gods' council convened in the celestial realm to address the unprecedented defiance that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had demonstrated. The divine assembly, presided over by Anu, and including all the major deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, faced a crisis that threatened the fundamental order of their cosmic hierarchy. Two mortals had now killed both Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, and the Bull of Heaven, Ishtar's instrument of divine justice. These acts represented not merely individual crimes, but a pattern of behaviour that challenged the very foundations of divine authority over the mortal world. The debate that unfolded in the Divine Council revealed the complexity of the gods' relationship with exceptional mortals, and the difficulty of maintaining cosmic order when faced with beings whose capabilities approached divine levels. Enlil, the god of wind and storms, argued forcefully that both heroes deserved death for their repeated violations of divine will, emphasizing that allowing such defiance to go unpunished would encourage similar acts of rebellion throughout the human world. His position reflected the traditional view that mortals must remain subordinate to divine authority, regardless of their individual achievements or capabilities. Shamash, the sun god who had blessed the hero's expedition to the cedar forest, offered a more nuanced perspective that acknowledged the moral complexity of the situation. He pointed out that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had acted with courage and honour in their confrontations with supernatural enemies, and that their victories had been achieved through legitimate means rather than trickery or divine assistance. The sun god's argument emphasized that punishing heroes for defending their city and people would undermine the very values that the gods claim to represent, creating a contradiction that could damage divine credibility among mortal worshippers. The goddess Uruk, who had created Enkidu in response to the prayers of Uruk's oppressed citizens, found herself in the difficult position of defending her creation while acknowledging the validity of her fellow deities' concerns. Her argument focused on the original purpose of Enkidu's existence, emphasizing that he'd been designed to moderate Gilgamesh's behavior and transform him from a tyrant into a just ruler. The wild man's success in achieving this goal had benefited not only the people of Uruk, but the cosmic order itself, as it had restored proper balance between royal power and divine authority. However, she also acknowledged that Enkidu's continued existence posed potential risks if his influence encouraged further acts of defiance against divine will. The compromise that emerged from the Divine Council's deliberations reflected the gods' recognition that some punishment was necessary to maintain cosmic order, while avoiding the complete destruction of two heroes whose achievements had earned them a measure of divine respect. The decision that one of the two friends must die was presented as a balanced solution that would demonstrate divine authority while preserving the life of the survivor, as a testament to the god's capacity for mercy. The choice of Enkidu as the victim was influenced by his status as a created being rather than a naturally born human, making his death less disruptive to the established order of mortal society. The divine illness that began to consume Enkidu manifested initially as a series of disturbing dreams that invaded his sleep with increasing frequency and intensity. These visions, sent by the gods as harbingers of his approaching doom, revealed aspects of the afterlife that no living mortal had ever been permitted to witness. The dreams began with images of a vast underground realm where the dead existed in perpetual twilight, their forms reduced to shadowy echoes of their former selves. The landscape of this netherworld was barren and desolate, with rivers of bitter water and plains of dust that stretched beyond the horizon, under a sky that never changed from its eternal grey. The inhabitants of this underworld realm appeared to Enkidu as figures of profound melancholy, their faces bearing the weight of eternal separation from the living world they had once known. Former kings and commoners alike wandered the dusty plains in identical garments of feathers and clay, their royal regalia and personal possessions reduced to meaningless symbols in a realm where earthly distinctions held no value. The vision emphasized the universal nature of death's dominion, showing how even the mightiest rulers and most accomplished warriors became equal in their powerlessness before the forces that govern the afterlife. The guardian of the underworld gates appeared in Enkidu's dreams as a figure of terrifying authority, with features that combined human intelligence with the predatory aspects of birds of prey. This being, whose role was to prevent the dead from returning to the living world, possessed claws that could tear through any material and eyes that could see through any deception or disguise. The guardian's presence in the dreams served as a warning that Enkidu's fate was sealed and that no earthly power could prevent his journey to the realm of the dead. As the divine illness progressed, Enkidu's physical condition began to deteriorate in ways that reflected the supernatural nature of his affliction. His superhuman strength, which had allowed him to match Gilgamesh in combat and wrestle the Bull of Heaven to submission, gradually ebbed away like water flowing from a broken vessel. His senses, once acute enough to track animals across vast distances and detect the approach of enemies, became dulled and unreliable. The vitality that had sustained him through years of wilderness survival and dangerous adventures drained from his body, leaving him increasingly dependent on others for basic needs. The psychological impact of the illness was even more devastating than its physical effects, as Enkidu found himself confronting the reality of mortality for the first time in his existence. His creation by divine hands had given him a sense of permanence and invulnerability that made the prospect of death almost incomprehensible. The gradual loss of his abilities and the increasing weakness of his body forced him to confront the finite nature of existence in ways that his wilderness upbringing had never required. The fear and confusion that accompanied this realization created an emotional turmoil that was visible to everyone who encountered him during his final days. The deathbed curses that Enkidu pronounced in his delirium reflected the complex emotions that the dying hero experienced as he contemplated his fate and the circumstances that had led to his divine punishment. His initial rage was directed toward the trapper who had first discovered him in the wilderness and initiated the chain of events that brought him to civilization. The curse he pronounced upon this man was comprehensive and vindictive, calling for the destruction of his livelihood and the failure of all his future endeavors. The intensity of Enkidu's anger reflected his belief that his encounter with human civilization had ultimately led to his doom, transforming him from a free creature of the wilderness into a victim of divine politics. The sacred prostitute who had been instrumental in Enkidu's transformation from wild man to civilized being also became the target of his dying rage, as he blamed her for introducing him to the pleasures and complications of human society. His curse upon her was particularly cruel, calling for her to be abandoned by all who had once sought her services and to spend her remaining years in poverty and disgrace. The bitterness of this condemnation revealed the depth of Enkidu's regret about his decision to leave the wilderness and embrace the civilized world that had ultimately betrayed him. However, as Enkidu's illness progressed and his mind cleared from the initial delirium of his condition, his perspective on his transformation began to shift toward a more balanced assessment of his experiences. The intervention of Shamash, speaking through divine inspiration, helped him recognize the positive aspects of his journey from wilderness to civilization and the meaningful relationships he had formed along the way. The sun god's words reminded him of the joy he had found in friendship with Gilgamesh and the satisfaction he had derived from protecting the innocent and fighting against injustice. The blessings that replaced Enkidu's curses demonstrated his growing acceptance of his fate and his recognition that his life, though brief, had been filled with experiences and achievements that gave it meaning and value. His blessing upon the trapper acknowledged the man's role in bringing him to a larger world, where his abilities could be used for noble purposes rather than merely ensuring survival. The revised blessing transformed the trapper's future from one of failure and hardship to one of success and prosperity, reflecting Enkidu's understanding that their encounter had ultimately benefited both of them. The blessing he bestowed upon the sacred prostitute was even more generous, as he recognized her crucial role in his transformation and the kindness she had shown him during his transition from wilderness to civilization. His words called for her to be honored and respected by all who knew her, with a life filled with abundance and joy that would compensate for any hardships she might have endured. The transformation of his curse into a blessing represented Enkidu's growing wisdom and his acceptance of the complex nature of human existence, with its mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. Gilgamesh's vigil over his dying friend became an ordeal that tested every aspect of his character and forced him to confront the reality of mortality in ways that his divine heritage had never required. The king's initial response to Enkidu's illness was denial, as he refused to accept that his companion's condition was beyond the reach of human medicine or divine intervention. He summoned the finest physicians in Uruk and consulted with priests and soothsayers. desperately seeking some remedy that could restore his friend's health and strength. The failure of these efforts to produce any improvement in Enkidu's condition gradually forced Gilgamesh to acknowledge the supernatural nature of the illness and its inevitable outcome. The physical changes that Gilgamesh observed in his friend during the final days of the illness were heartbreaking in their relentless progression. The massive frame that had once matched his own in strength and in endurance became gaunt and wasted, while the wild mane of hair that had marked Enkidu's connection to the natural world became thin and lifeless. The eyes that had once blazed with the fire of untamed wilderness grew dim and unfocused, while the voice that had once commanded respect from both humans and animals became weak and uncertain. Each day brought new evidence of the approaching end, despite Gilgamesh's desperate attempts to maintain hope and find solutions. The emotional impact of watching his closest friend slowly die created a psychological crisis that shattered Gilgamesh's understanding of his own nature and destiny. The divine heritage that had made him feel superior to ordinary mortals offered no protection against the grief and helplessness that consumed him as he witnessed Enkidu's suffering. The friendship that had transformed him from a tyrant into a just ruler was being destroyed by forces beyond his control, leaving him to face the prospect of returning to the isolation that had originally corrupted his character. The fear of losing the relationship that had given his life meaning and purpose created an anxiety that affected every aspect of his behavior and decision-making. The desperate measures that Gilgamesh employed in his attempts to save Enkidu's life revealed the depth of his devotion and the extent of his refusal to accept the reality of divine judgment. He offered elaborate sacrifices to every god in the Mesopotamian pantheon, hoping to find one who might be willing to intervene on his friend's behalf. The treasures he promised in exchange for Enkidu's recovery included not only his personal wealth, but the resources of his entire kingdom, demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of their friendship. The failure of these offerings to produce any divine response gradually forced him to recognize that the god's decision was final and irreversible. As Enkidu's condition deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery, Gilgamesh's vigil became a meditation on the nature of mortality and the meaning of existence in a world where even the strongest and most virtuous individuals were subject to forces beyond their control. The king's divine parentage, which had once seemed to guarantee his superiority over ordinary humans, now appeared to be a cruel joke that had allowed him to form attachments that would inevitably be severed by death. The realization that his own immortality would force him to witness the death of everyone he cared about created an existential crisis that would define the remainder of his life and drive him to seek solutions that transcended the normal boundaries of human existence. The final breath that escaped Enkidu's lips came with the first light of dawn, a gentle exhalation that seemed to carry his spirit into the pale morning sky. Gilgamesh, who had maintained his vigil through the long night, initially refused to acknowledge what his senses told him. He pressed his ear to Enkidu's chest, listening desperately for any sign of life, his hands searching for a pulse that would never return. The stillness of his friend's body was absolute. The massive frame that had once wrestled divine bulls now as motionless as carved stone. The wild hair that had marked Enkidu's connection to the natural world lay matted against his skull, while his eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling of the royal chamber where he had spent his final hours. The king's initial response was a roar of anguish that echoed through the palace corridors and awakened every inhabitant of the royal complex. The sound carried such raw emotion that servants and guards who heard it were moved to tears, though they did not yet understand the cause of their sovereign's distress. Gilgamesh's cry was not merely an expression of grief, but a challenge hurled at the gods themselves, a denial of their authority to separate him from the one person who had given his existence meaning and purpose. The walls of the chamber seemed to tremble with the force of his emotion, while the very air appeared to shimmer with the intensity of his pain. For 7 days and 7 nights, Gilgamesh refused to allow anyone to remove Enkidu's body from the royal chamber. He positioned himself beside the funeral couch, like a guardian protecting precious treasure, his great sword drawn and ready to strike down anyone who approached with the intention of taking his friend away. The king's appearance during this period was shocking to those who had known him as the epitome of royal dignity and controlled power. His hair became dishevelled and unkempt, while his royal garments grew stained with tears and the debris of his vigil. His eyes, once bright with the confidence of divine heritage, became hollow and haunted, reflecting an inner devastation that seemed to age him years in the span of days. The palace staff attempted to maintain their normal routines, but the king's grief had created an atmosphere of mourning that affected every aspect of court life. Officials who came seeking royal decisions found themselves turned away by guards who dared not disturb their sovereign's vigil. Trade delegations and diplomatic missions were left waiting in the outer courtyards, their business suspended indefinitely while the kingdom's ruler remained locked in his private struggle with mortality. The administrative machinery that had governed Uruk's daily operations began to slow and stutter as the absence of royal authority created uncertainty about how to proceed with routine matters. The physical changes that began to appear in Enkidu's body as the days passed forced Gilgamesh to confront the reality of death in its most undeniable form. The skin that had once glowed with the vitality of wilderness life began to take on the waxy pallor of decay, while the muscles that had possessed superhuman strength started to lose their definition and firmness. The scent of mortality, subtle at first but growing stronger with each passing hour, filled the chamber with an odour that no amount of incense could mask. Most disturbing of all were the small movements that Gilgamesh detected from the corner of his eye, the first signs of the insects that would soon claim dominion over his friend's mortal remains. The appearance of maggots in Enkidu's flesh marked the moment when even Gilgamesh's denial could no longer withstand the evidence of his senses. The tiny white larvae that emerged from the corpse's orifices were nature's most honest messengers, announcing with their presence that the body which had once housed his friend's spirit was now nothing more than decaying matter, subject to the same processes that claimed all organic life. The king's reaction to this discovery was a mixture of revulsion and desperate sorrow, as he finally understood that no amount of willpower or divine heritage could restore what death had claimed. The funeral preparations that followed Gilgamesh's acceptance of Enkidu's death were the most elaborate in Uruk's history, reflecting both the king's love for his friend and his desperate need to honour the memory of their partnership. The royal treasury was open to provide materials for a burial that would rival those of the greatest kings, with precious metals and gemstones gathered from across the known world. Master craftsmen worked day and night to create grave goods worthy of a hero who had fought beside gods and defeated monsters that had terrorized the earth for millennia. The funeral couch itself was carved from the finest cedar wood brought back from their expedition to the sacred forest, its surface inlaid with gold and silver in patterns that told the story of their adventures together. The burial ceremony drew mourners from throughout Mesopotamia, as word of Enkidu's death spread among the communities that had heard tales of his heroic deeds. Kings and princes who had never met the wild man personally came to pay their respects, understanding that his death marked the end of an era in which mortals had achieved feats that rivaled the accomplishments of legendary heroes. The procession that carried Enkidu's body to its final resting place stretched for miles, with musicians, priests and professional mourners creating a symphony of grief that could be heard across the entire city. The tomb itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry, carved deep into the earth and furnished with everything that the deceased might need for his journey to the afterlife. However, even the grandest funeral could not fill the void that Enkidu's death had created in Gilgamesh's existence. The king's grief was not merely personal but existential, as he struggled to find meaning in the world where even the strongest and most virtuous individuals were subject to forces beyond their control. The friendship that had transformed him from a tyrant into a just ruler was gone, leaving him to face the prospect of returning to the isolation that had originally corrupted his character. The fear of losing the relationship that had given his life purpose created an anxiety that affected every aspect of his behaviour and decision-making. The royal duties that had once provided structure and meaning to Gilgamesh's days now seemed hollow and pointless in the face of mortality's ultimate authority. The administrative meetings that filled his schedule dealt with concerns that appeared trivial when measured against the cosmic forces that had claimed his friend's life. Trade negotiations and diplomatic conferences continued, but the king's participation was mechanical and distracted, his mind focused on questions that no earthly authority could answer. The citizens of Uruk, who had celebrated their ruler's transformation from tyrant to hero, now watched with growing concern as grief threatened to undo the progress he'd made in learning to govern with wisdom and compassion. The abandonment of his royal responsibilities began gradually, as Gilgamesh found himself unable to concentrate on the mundane details of governance, while his mind wrestled with the implications of mortality. Court sessions that had once been models of efficiency and decisive leadership became exercises in distraction and delay, with the king's attention wandering to memories of his adventures with Enkidu, rather than focusing on the matters at hand. The elaborate ceremonies and rituals that had once reinforced his authority now seemed like meaningless pageantry, empty gestures that could not address the fundamental questions about existence that his friend's death had raised. The transformation in Gilgamesh's appearance reflected his internal struggle with grief and his growing disconnection from the civilized world that had once defined his identity. The carefully groomed beard that had marked his royal status grew wild and unkempt, while his hair became matted and dishevelled from his habit of pulling at it during moments of particular anguish. The royal garments that had once proclaimed his divine heritage were abandoned in favour of simple robes that reflected his diminished interest in the symbols of earthly power. His skin, once bronzed from outdoor activities and glowing with health, became pale and drawn from sleepless nights and irregular eating habits. The decision to don animal skins represented a deliberate rejection of the civilized world that had failed to protect his friend from divine punishment. The rough pelts that Gilgamesh chose were not the carefully prepared and decorated garments worn by hunters and herders, but crude coverings that emphasized his growing identification with the wilderness that had been Enkidu's original home. The transformation was shocking to those who had known him as the epitome of royal dignity, but it reflected his psychological need to maintain some connection to his departed friend through the adoption of symbols associated with his wild origins. The flight from Uruk that followed this transformation was not a planned expedition, but a desperate escape from reminders of his loss and the responsibilities that seemed meaningless in the face of mortality. Gilgamesh left the palace in the early hours of morning, slipping past guards who were too stunned by his appearance to challenge his departure. The great gates of the city that had once symbolized his power and authority now seemed like prison walls that confined him to a world where death held ultimate dominion. The wilderness that stretched beyond Uruk's borders called to him with promises of solitude and the possibility of finding answers to questions that civilized society could not address. The physical challenges of wilderness survival, which had once been academic concerns for a king accustomed to palace comfort, now became daily realities that tested his resolve and resourcefulness. The skills that Enkidu had taught him during their adventures together proved invaluable as he learned to find water in barren landscapes and locate edible plants in environments that seemed hostile to human life. The hardships of exposure to the elements, sleeping on rocky ground and subsisting on whatever food he could gather or hunt, served as a form of penance that helped him process his grief, while maintaining some connection to his friend's memory. The fear of death that had been awakened by Enkidu's passing became an obsession that dominated every aspect of Gilgamesh's existence. The divine heritage that had once made him feel superior to ordinary mortals now seemed like a cruel joke, as it had allowed him to form attachments that would inevitably be severed by forces beyond his control. The realization that his own mortality, despite his divine parentage, would eventually claim him as it had claimed his friend created a terror that drove him to seek solutions that transcended the normal boundaries of human existence. The prospect of facing eternity without the companionship that had given his life meaning was unbearable, motivating him to pursue possibilities that rational thought would have dismissed as impossible. The memories of ancient stories and legends that had been part of his royal education began to surface in his mind as he searched for examples of mortals who had achieved immortality, or at least extended their existence beyond normal human limits. The tale of Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood who had been granted eternal life by the gods, became a beacon of hope in his despair. The story, which had once seemed like mere mythology designed to entertain and instruct, now appeared to offer a genuine path to escape the mortality that threatened to separate him from Enkidu forever in the afterlife. The quest for Utnapishtim represented more than a search for immortality. It was a journey toward understanding the fundamental nature of existence and the possibility of transcending the limitations that defined mortal life. The legendary figure was said to dwell in a realm beyond the normal world, accessible only to those who possessed the courage and determination to overcome obstacles that had defeated every previous seeker. The challenges that lay ahead would test not only Gilgamesh's physical capabilities, but his mental and spiritual strength as he ventured into territories where the normal rules of existence no longer applied. The transformation from king to wandering hero was complete as Gilgamesh set out on his quest, his royal authority exchanged for the freedom and uncertainty of a life devoted to pursuing the impossible. The palace that had once been the center of his world became a distant memory, while the wilderness that had claimed his friend's origins became his new home. The journey that lay ahead would take him through lands that existed on the margins of the known world, where the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms became blurred, and the possibility of achieving the impossible might finally be within reach. The physical demands of the quest began immediately as Gilgamesh left the familiar territories surrounding Uruk and ventured into regions that few mortals had ever explored. The landscape gradually became more hostile and strange, with rock formations that seemed to defy natural processes and vegetation that appeared to follow patterns unknown to conventional botany. The climate shifted unpredictably, with scorching heat giving way to bitter cold without the gradual transitions that characterize normal weather patterns. The very air seemed different, carrying scents and sounds that suggested the presence of forces that operated according to rules unlike those that governed the ordinary world. The wildlife that Gilgamesh encountered during his journey was unlike anything he'd seen during his previous adventures, including creatures that seemed to exist on the boundary between the natural and supernatural realms. Some animals displayed intelligence and awareness that exceeded normal bestial capacity, while others possessed physical characteristics that suggested divine influence in their creation. The predators that stalked him through the wilderness were not merely dangerous but seemed to be testing his resolve and determination, as if they were guardians placed to discourage unworthy seekers from continuing their quest. The solitude that accompanied Gilgamesh's journey was profound and complete, creating an isolation that was both physical and spiritual. The absence of human companionship forced him to confront his thoughts and emotions without the distractions that had previously helped him avoid the full impact of his loss. The silence of the wilderness was broken only by the sounds of his own movement and the occasional calls of distant animals, creating an environment where every footstep seemed to echo with the weight of his purpose. The stars that had once seemed like distant decorations in the night sky now appeared to be watching his progress with interest that was both comforting and unsettling. The psychological impact of his quest began to manifest in dreams and visions that seemed to offer guidance while simultaneously testing his sanity and resolve. The images that appeared in his sleep were not the random products of an exhausted mind, but coherent messages that provided clues about the path he needed to follow and the challenges he would face. Some visions showed him glimpses of Utnapishtim's dwelling place, a realm where the normal rules of time and space seemed to be suspended in favour of principles that operated according to divine rather than natural law. Other dreams revealed the obstacles that lay ahead, including guardians and barriers that would require all of his strength and cunning to overcome. The gradual realization that his quest might be impossible began to compete with his determination to succeed, creating an internal conflict that threatened to undermine his resolve. The rational part of his mind recognized that the stories of immortal humans might be nothing more than wishful thinking, myths created to comfort mortals faced with the inevitability of death. However, the emotional need to believe that death was not the final answer to existence drove him forward despite the growing evidence that his journey might be futile. The tension between hope and despair became a constant companion that influenced every decision and coloured every experience along his path. The physical toll of his journey was becoming apparent as weeks of wilderness travel began to wear down even his superhuman constitution. The lack of adequate food and shelter was causing his body to lose the muscle mass and vitality that had once made him a match for divine opponents, while the constant stress of survival in hostile environments was aging him in ways that normal time could not achieve. The animal skins that served as his clothing became tattered and inadequate, providing little protection against the elements that seemed to grow more severe as he ventured deeper into unknown territories. The weapons that had once been symbols of his power became tools for basic survival, their polished surfaces dulled by constant use and their edges chipped from encounters with obstacles that would have been unthinkable in his former life. The journey toward the edge of the world led Gilgamesh through increasingly desolate territories where the familiar landmarks of civilization gave way to landscapes that seemed to exist outside the normal order of creation. The mountains that rose before him were not the gentle hills that surrounded Uruk, but jagged peaks that clawed at the sky with surfaces of black stone that reflected no light. The valleys between these peaks were filled with mists that never lifted, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that made navigation treacherous and disorienting. The very air seemed thinner and more difficult to breathe, as if the normal mixture of elements that sustained life was being gradually replaced by something alien and hostile to human existence. The approach to Mount Mashu, the legendary gateway to the underworld and the realm where the sun began its daily journey across the heavens, was marked by phenomena that defied natural explanation. The mountain itself was a massive twin-peaked formation that seemed to stretch infinitely upward, its summits lost in clouds that glowed with an inner light that was neither solar nor lunar in origin. The base of the mountain was shrouded in darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it, creating a zone of shadow that extended for miles in all directions. The silence that surrounded the mountain was absolute, broken neither by wind nor the calls of animals, as if all natural life had been banished from this threshold between worlds. The tunnel that penetrated the heart of Mount Mashu was an artificial construction of such ancient origin that its builders had been forgotten by all but the most obscure legends. The entrance was a perfect circle carved into the living rock, its edges smooth and precise, in a way that suggested divine rather than mortal craftsmanship. The interior walls were covered with symbols and inscriptions in scripts that predated even the earliest cuneiform writing, their meanings lost to time, but their presence suggesting that this passage had been used by beings whose knowledge exceeded anything possessed by contemporary civilization. The tunnel stretched into darkness so profound that Even the most powerful torches could penetrate only a few feet before their light was swallowed by the consuming blackness. The scorpion men who guarded this passage were beings that existed on the boundary between the natural and supernatural realms, their forms combining human intelligence with the predatory instincts of their arachnid namesakes. Their bodies were humanoid from the waist up, with muscular torsos covered in chitinous plates that gleamed like polished bronze in the dim light that emanated from their own supernatural essence. Their arms ended in claws capable of crushing stone, while their faces retained human features but with eyes that glowed with an inner fire that could see through any deception or disguise. From the waist down, their bodies were those of enormous scorpions, with segmented tails that curved over their backs and terminated in stingers that dripped with venom capable of killing gods. The encounter with these guardians required Gilgamesh to demonstrate not only his physical courage, but his understanding of the cosmic forces that governed the boundary between life and death. The scorpion men did not attack immediately, but instead subjected him to a form of interrogation that tested his knowledge of divine law and his worthiness to enter the realm beyond mortal existence. Their questions were not spoken aloud, but communicated through a form of telepathic contact that allowed them to examine his thoughts and motivations directly. The process was invasive and uncomfortable, as if his mind was being dissected by alien intelligences that operated according to principles he could not comprehend. The revelation of Gilgamesh's divine parentage through his mother Ninsun was what ultimately convinced the scorpion men to grant him passage through the tunnel. His semi-divine nature marked him as one of the few mortals who possessed the inherent qualities necessary to survive the journey through the mountain's heart and emerge into the realm where normal physical laws no longer applied. However, the Guardians warned him that divine heritage alone would not guarantee his success, as the path ahead would test aspects of his character that had nothing to do with strength or royal authority. The tunnel itself was a form of trial that would strip away all pretense and reveal the true nature of his soul. The journey through the tunnel of Mount Mashu was an ordeal that lasted 12 hours of absolute darkness, during which Gilgamesh had to navigate by touch and instinct through passages that seemed to shift and change around him. The walls that had appeared solid and permanent at the entrance became fluid and unpredictable, sometimes narrowing to the point where he had to crawl on his hands and knees, other times opening into vast chambers where his footsteps echoed for minutes before the sound finally faded. The air within the tunnel was stale and oppressive, carrying scents that suggested the presence of ancient death and decay mixed with something that might have been the breath of sleeping gods. The psychological impact of the tunnel journey was as challenging as its physical demands, as the complete absence of light created a sensory deprivation that began to affect Gilgamesh's perception of time and space. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours, while hours compressed into moments, creating a disorientation that made it impossible to judge his progress or estimate how much of the journey remained. The silence was so complete that he began to hear sounds that existed only in his imagination, including whispers in languages he did not recognize, and the distant sound of water flowing through channels that might have been real or merely the product of his increasingly stressed mind. The emergence from the tunnel into the Garden of the Gods was a transition so abrupt and overwhelming that it temporarily blinded Gilgamesh, with its brilliance and beauty. The realm that lay beyond Mount Mashu was not subject to the normal cycles of day and night, but existed in a state of perpetual dawn, with light that seemed to emanate from the very air rather than from any visible source. The garden itself was a paradise that exceeded any earthly location in its perfection, with trees that bore fruit made of precious gems and flowers that bloomed in colours that had no names in mortal languages. The paths that wound through this divine landscape were paved with stones that had been polished to mirror brightness, while streams of crystal-clear water flowed in channels lined with gold and silver. The trees in this supernatural garden were not merely decorative, but served as repositories of divine knowledge and power, their branches heavy with fruit that could grant various forms of enlightenment to those deemed worthy of consuming them. The tree of wisdom bore apples of pure sapphire that contained all the knowledge accumulated since the beginning of time, while the tree of strength produced golden pears that could restore youth and vitality to even the most aged and weakened individuals. The tree of prophecy was laden with silver grapes that allowed those who ate them to see glimpses of future events, though the visions came at the cost of understanding their true meaning. The divine beings who tended this garden were not the familiar gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, but rather primordial entities whose existence predated the creation of the mortal world. These beings appeared as figures of living light, whose forms shifted and changed according to principles that mortal minds could not comprehend, sometimes appearing as humans of impossible beauty, and other times manifesting as geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Their communication with Gilgamesh was conducted through methods that transcended normal speech, with meaning transmitted directly into his consciousness through processes that bypassed his physical senses entirely. The guidance that these divine gardeners provided was cryptic and indirect, offering hints about the location of Utnapishtim's dwelling without providing explicit directions that would make the journey too easy. They spoke of waters that must be crossed and guardians that must be faced, of tests that would require wisdom rather than strength, and challenges that could not be overcome through conventional means. Their words carried warnings about the futility of seeking immortality, while simultaneously suggesting that the quest itself might serve purposes beyond the seeker's original intentions. The departure from the garden required Gilgamesh to make choices about which paths to follow and which divine gifts to accept for the journey ahead. The beings who ruled this realm offered him various forms of assistance, including weapons that could harm supernatural enemies and provisions that would sustain him through regions where normal food could not be found. However, they also warned him that accepting too much divine aid would compromise the authenticity of his quest and potentially disqualify him from achieving his ultimate goal. The balance between necessary assistance and self-reliance became a crucial consideration that would influence every decision he made during the remainder of his journey. The ocean that lay beyond the garden was unlike any body of water that existed in the mortal world, its surface reflecting not the sky above, but images of distant realms and possible futures that shifted and changed with each passing moment. The waters themselves were not composed of ordinary liquid, but of a substance that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, sometimes appearing as normal water, and other times taking on the consistency of liquid light or crystallized time. The shore was lined with sand that consisted of ground pearls and pulverized gemstones, while the waves that lapped against the beach made sounds like distant music played on instruments that had never been heard by mortal ears. The ferryman who operated the only vessel capable of crossing these supernatural waters was a figure whose appearance suggested great age and wisdom combined with an otherworldly detachment from normal human concerns. His boat was constructed from materials that did not exist in the mortal realm, with a hull that seemed to be carved from a single enormous pearl and sails woven from threads of pure moonlight. The craft moved not through conventional propulsion but by responding to the ferryman's will, gliding across the water's surface without creating any disturbance or wake that would indicate its passage. The crossing of the waters of death required Gilgamesh to demonstrate his worthiness through actions rather than words, as the ferryman subjected him to tests that revealed the true nature of his character and motivations. The journey across the supernatural ocean was not merely a matter of transportation but a form of purification that stripped away the accumulated influences of mortal existence and prepared him for the encounter with immortality that awaited him on the far shore. The process was both physically and spiritually demanding, requiring him to maintain his focus and determination while surrounded by visions and temptations that could easily have led him astray from his purpose. The island where Utnapishtim dwelt existed in a state of temporal suspension that made it immune to the normal processes of change and decay that affected the rest of creation. The landscape was perfectly preserved in the condition it had possessed at the moment of the great flood's end, with every tree and stone exactly as they had been when the waters receded and dry land appeared once again. The air itself seemed to be filled with the memory of that ancient catastrophe, carrying scents of rain and mud mixed with the lingering traces of divine wrath that had nearly destroyed all life on earth. Utnapishtim himself was a figure of profound dignity and sadness, his appearance reflecting the weight of centuries spent in isolation from the world he'd once known. His physical form showed no signs of aging or decay, but his eyes held the accumulated sorrow of someone who had witnessed the destruction of everything he had once held dear. His clothing was simple and practical, made from materials that had been common before the flood but had since become extinct in the changed world that emerged from the catastrophe. His movements were deliberate and careful, as if he was constantly aware of the fragility of existence and the need to treat every moment with appropriate reverence. The account of the great flood that Utnapishtim shared with Gilgamesh was not merely a historical narrative, but a profound meditation on the relationship between divine justice and human suffering. The story began with the gods' decision to destroy humanity due to their excessive noise and general corruption, a judgment that reflected the deity's growing frustration with the chaos and violence that had come to characterize mortal civilization. The Divine Council's deliberations had been lengthy and contentious, with some gods arguing for complete annihilation, while others advocated for more selective punishment that would preserve the possibility of human redemption. The selection of Utnapishtim as the sole human survivor was based not on his moral superiority, but on his practical skills and his willingness to follow divine instructions without question or hesitation. The god Ea had chosen him because of his experience as a builder and his reputation for reliability, qualities that would be essential for the successful completion of the massive construction project that would preserve life through the coming catastrophe. The warning that Ea provided was delivered in coded language that required careful interpretation, as the god was technically violating the Divine Council's decision to keep the flood secret from humanity. The construction of the Ark was a project that required not only enormous physical labour, but also precise attention to divine specifications that ensured the vessel would be capable of surviving the supernatural forces that would be unleashed during the flood. The dimensions that Ea provided were not arbitrary, but were calculated to create a structure that could maintain stability in waters that would be subject to forces far beyond those encountered in normal storms. The materials used in construction were not merely the finest available, but were specifically chosen for their ability to withstand the corrosive effects of divine wrath made manifest in physical form. The gathering of animals and supplies for the Ark required Utnapishtim to make difficult decisions about which species and individuals would be preserved, and which would be abandoned to the coming destruction. The divine instructions were specific about the need to maintain breeding pairs of all animal species, but the practical limitations of space and resources meant that many individual creatures would necessarily be left behind. The emotional toll of these selections was enormous, as Utnapishtim was forced to play the role of divine judge, while knowing that his choices would determine the future composition of life on Earth. The flood itself was a catastrophe that exceeded anything in recorded human experience, with waters that rose not gradually but in massive surges that overwhelmed even the highest mountains within hours of the deluge's beginning. The rain that fell was not ordinary precipitation but liquid that seemed to carry the concentrated essence of divine fury, burning everything it touched and transforming familiar landscapes into alien seascapes that bore no resemblance to the world that had existed before. The winds that accompanied the flood were not natural weather phenomena, but the breath of angry gods, carrying sounds and scents that spoke of cosmic forces unleashed without restraint or mercy. The duration of the flood was 7 days and 7 nights, a period that seemed to stretch into eternity for those who experienced it from within the Ark's confines. The vessel was subjected to stresses that would have destroyed any conventional ship, with waves that towered higher than mountains and currents that seemed to flow in all directions simultaneously. The sounds of destruction that penetrated the Ark's walls were unlike anything that had ever been heard before, combining the crash of collapsing civilizations with the screams of dying creatures and the roar of elements that had been transformed into instruments of divine vengeance. The testing of the flood's end through the release of birds was a process that required careful timing and interpretation, as the behaviour of these creatures would determine when it was safe to emerge from the Ark's protection. The first bird, a dove, returned with clear signs of distress and exhaustion, indicating that the waters still covered all available land and that no suitable resting place could be found. The second dove returned with an olive branch, suggesting that vegetation was beginning to emerge from the receding waters, but that the process of restoration was still in its early stages. The third bird, a raven, did not return at all, indicating that sufficient dry land was now available to support independent life. The emergence from the Ark into the transformed world was a moment of profound mixed emotions, as Utnapishtim experienced both gratitude for survival and overwhelming grief for the destruction of everything he had once known. The landscape that greeted him bore no resemblance to the world that had existed before the flood, with familiar landmarks erased and new geographical features created by the supernatural forces that had shaped the Earth's surface. The silence was oppressive and unnatural, broken only by the sounds of water still draining from elevated areas and the occasional calls of the few creatures that had survived the catastrophe. The divine reward of immortality that the gods granted to Utnapishtim was not the blessing that it might have appeared to be, but rather a form of exile that separated him forever from the normal cycles of human existence. The gift came with the understanding that he would never again be able to participate in the community of mortals, as his unchanging nature would make him an object of fear and suspicion among people who were subject to aging and death. The immortality was therefore both a recognition of his service to the gods and a punishment that condemned him to eternal isolation from the species he had helped preserve. The test of staying awake for 7 days and 7 nights that Utnapishtim imposed on Gilgamesh was designed to demonstrate the fundamental incompatibility between mortal nature and the demands of immortal existence. The challenge appeared simple on its surface, requiring only the ability to resist sleep for a limited period, but it actually tested the seeker's capacity to transcend the basic physiological needs that defined human existence. The failure to remain awake would prove that the petitioner was still bound by the limitations of mortal flesh, and therefore unworthy of the divine gift that would free him from those constraints. Gilgamesh's failure in this test was both predictable and tragic, as his exhaustion from the long journey and the accumulated stress of his quest made it impossible for him to maintain the level of alertness that the challenge required. The bread that Utnapishtim's wife baked each day of the test served as undeniable proof of how long the king had slept, with the varying degrees of staleness marking the passage of time in a way that could not be disputed or explained away. The sight of these loaves upon his awakening was a devastating blow to his hopes, as it demonstrated beyond question that his mortal nature had betrayed him at the crucial moment. The plant of youth that Utnapishtim revealed as a consolation prize was located at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, in depths where the pressure would crush any normal human, and where the waters themselves possessed properties that could dissolve mortal flesh. The plant itself was a thorny specimen that required careful handling to avoid injury, its surface covered with spines that could inflict wounds that would never heal properly. The extraction of this plant required Gilgamesh to demonstrate the same kind of desperate courage that had carried him through his previous adventures, diving into waters that existed at the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms. The successful retrieval of the plant represented a partial victory that offered hope for a different kind of immortality, one that would allow him to renew his youth periodically rather than achieving the complete transcendence of mortality that he had originally sought. The plant's properties were not permanent but would need to be used repeatedly to maintain their effects, creating a form of conditional immortality that would require constant vigilance and careful planning. The possession of this treasure filled Gilgamesh with renewed hope and a sense that his quest had not been entirely futile, despite his failure to achieve his original goal. The loss of the plant to the serpent was a final cruel twist that demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to escape the fundamental conditions of mortal existence. The snake that consumed the plant while Gilgamesh bathed was not an ordinary reptile, but a creature that possessed the wisdom to recognize the treasure's value and the cunning to steal it at the moment when the king's guard was relaxed. The serpent's immediate shedding of its skin after consuming the plant served as a visible demonstration of the regenerative power that Gilgamesh had briefly possessed and lost through his own carelessness. The return journey to Uruk was a time of profound reflection and gradual acceptance of the limitations that defined human existence. The king's appearance had been transformed by his experiences, with his hair now streaked with grey and his face bearing lines that spoke of wisdom gained through suffering. The animal skins that had marked his rejection of civilization were gradually replaced by more conventional clothing as he prepared to resume his role as ruler of his people. The weapons that had served him during his quest were cleaned and polished, ready to be used once again in the service of his kingdom, rather than in pursuit of impossible dreams. The sight of Uruk's walls rising from the Mesopotamian plain was a moment of recognition that marked the end of his quest and the beginning of his acceptance of mortality as the defining characteristic of human existence. The city that had once seemed like a prison now appeared as a haven where he could find meaning and purpose within the constraints of finite existence. The people who had once been subjects to be dominated were now revealed as fellow travellers on the journey toward death, deserving of protection and guidance from someone who had learned the true value of the time that was given to all mortals. The wisdom that Gilgamesh brought back from his failed quest was not the immortality he had sought, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where death gave meaning to life and where the temporary nature of existence made every moment precious. His transformation from a king who had sought to transcend mortality into a ruler who embraced the responsibility of guiding his people through their brief time on earth represented the true victory of his journey. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in the tablets of Ashurbanipal's library and rediscovered by modern scholars, continues to speak to readers across the millennia about the eternal human struggle to find meaning in the face of mortality and the ultimate wisdom that comes from accepting the limitations that define our existence. The legacy of Gilgamesh's story extends far beyond its original Mesopotamian context, influencing literary traditions throughout the ancient world and providing a template for heroic narratives that continue to resonate with modern audiences. The epic's exploration of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning in a finite existence addresses fundamental questions that remain as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago when the story was first recorded in cuneiform script. The rediscovery of this ancient masterpiece by 19th century archaeologists opened new windows into the earliest expressions of human consciousness and creativity, demonstrating that the concerns and aspirations that define our species have remained remarkably consistent across the vast expanse of recorded history.